everybody's here. It looks like quite a few of us. I would see if Abigail could, is she on, Abigail?
Hi, Mr. Chairman, I'm on.
Thank you. Can you, yes, can you do roll call, please?
Yes. We've got Senator Agar,
Yes.
Senator Selmy Dalton,
Present.
Senator Dockstader,
Here.
Senator Driscoll,
Excused.
Senator Moniz.
Here.
Who's here? I didn't, oh yeah. Representative Blake,
Here.
Representative Eklund,
Here.
Representative Hunt,
Here.
Representative Paxton,
Here.
Representative Simpson,
Here.
Vice Chairman Larson,
Here.
and Chairman Hicks.
Here.
All right, we have a quorum.
Thank you. I think Chairman Hicks said that I could go ahead and chair till break, and then we'll switch.
Okay.
So I think probably to get started, why don't we just, I think if Director Gephardt is on, we'll go ahead and get started with the Development Office. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. How are we all today?
Good.
Good. Start with the introduction that I've got with me. Brandon Gephardt, I'm the Director of Water Development.
Barry Lawrence.
Brian Clarkin. And off the screen, we have the Water Development Fiscal Manager, David Ray. And Jason Mead and Jody Pring. And from the State Engineer's Office, we have State Engineer Greg Lanning and Steve Wolf with us today.
Thank you. Great. If you would would like to begin, go ahead.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I believe it's on the agenda. It is probably item number 3, the Levitt Reservoir expansion. This is actually a new contract, but it should have been a time extension contract amendment. This one slipped through the cracks. We should have amended a time-only extension for the permitting liaison contract we have with the consultant to help us with permitting. We missed the deadline, so AG's office asked us for a new contract, so we just used the existing money that we had and created a new contract. So it essentially acts like a amendment, but it has to be a new contract. So we're just asking for your approval for that.
Okay, and I would, are there any questions for this? Yes, Co-Chair Hicks.
Yeah, Brandon, can you just go over real quick where we're at with the Levitt Reservoir project and just timeframes and what this extension does for the permitting side, where we're at with the overall permitting and the project as a whole?
Director, please.
Mr. Chairman, absolutely. Senator Hicks, Jason Mead can kind of update us on this.
Yeah, so Mr. Chairman, the NEPA, we were done with the environmental impact statement last spring of 19. The record of decision came out in the fall of last year. And we have basically the BLM right-of-way permit as well as the 404 permit in hand at this point, and are proceeding with final design. And that should be finished sometime this year, with plans expected to go out to bid shortly after the first of the year, and then start construction sometime next summer. The amendment is more or less as part of the 401 certification. We had to put together an adaptive management plan, and that involves baseline water quality monitoring, just to make sure that when the project is implemented, if it has any adverse impacts on water quality, then we have baseline information to tie that back to.
Follow up?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
So a follow-up on that, 401 is a certification that's issued through the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality as a condition on any federal permit. Could you reiterate what those 401 certification additional requirements are for the committee? I mean, is it water quality, but what exactly in the water quality are we looking at? Physical, chemical, biological? What parameters are being required on the 401? And I guess I would ask Jason too, along those lines, have we seen any increase in the regulatory requirements under the 401s compared to some of the other dam projects that we've had in the past?
Jason?
Mr. Chairman, I don't have that in front of me currently, but it basically goes back to water quality standards, Chapter 1 water quality standards, and basically meeting all those thresholds and not going above them. This one in particular, and Alkali Creek for that matter, are located in areas that have high E. coli. We have a couple of reaches in each watershed that are on the 303D list and have TMDLs for E. coli. And during the NEPA process, the EPA was concerned with the reservoirs basically removing spring flow, or removing, if you've ever heard of dilution is the solution for pollution, removing that dilution water in the spring and actually increasing concentrations. And we disagree with that, but I guess the compromise was this adaptive management plan. In regards to, and it also looks at potential for algae blooms and things of that nature, just high elevations or high levels of certain constituents, I guess, when the reservoir is built, both in the reservoir and downstream of the reservoir. And I guess I don't think it's anything different than what's been seen in the past, Senator Hicks. But I haven't been involved in, such as high savory stuff when it was being permitted either. So I don't have a real good background on that, but I don't think it's anything significantly more in depth than what we've seen in the past.
One more follow-up, and then I think Representative Hunt had a question too. Along those lines, my recollection, Alkali Creek is an off-channel reservoir. Was there a requirement under Section 401 certification to also do a stream quantification tool analysis with that project?
Mr. Chairman, yes. On Alkali Creek, it was required. That's considered an intermittent channel. On Levitt Reservoir, it was not required. Due to the length of channel that would be inundated, I guess, or the insignificance of the channel. Levitt Reservoir is a really small watershed area. It's also an off-channel reservoir site, but and that's on Alkali Creek. We're still having those discussions and going through that process with the Corps of Engineers on the 404 permit. We're currently putting together the compensatory mitigation plan for wetlands, aquatic resources, and going through the stream impact or the stream quantification tool. And it really doesn't lend itself to a reservoir situation where you're inundating streams. It's more of a, as you probably know, a stream enhancement tool, I would say, similar to what we're doing down below High Savory to see what the credits would be, or the lift. So we're having some conversations with the Corps on how to handle that. And we're getting together again, actually on site here towards the end of June to talk through that. But they realize that, I think, and hopefully they're willing to work with us on how we need to mitigate for that if we need to.
Yeah, and
Follow up?
Mr. Co-Chair, just something for staff. We took this up last year in Buffalo, this stream quantification tool with DEQ, and had some discussions at that point in time on the application of it. I guess I would like for our August meeting for Abigail, if we can get the Corps, invite them to come. I'm a little concerned based on my discussions with the Corps after our meetings last year, that this wasn't how the stream quantification tool was going to be applied. So it seems like an expansion over what I was told by the Corps on how it would be used, but I would like to get the Army Corps and the DEQ to come to our August meeting. Abigail, if we can contact them. And just for clarification, again, on this stream quantification tool and the application of it, where it will and will not be applied moving forward. So if we can get that down, Abigail, for an action item for our August meeting.
Hey,
I
Mr.
would
Vice
like-
Chairman, I've got that.
Okay.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Representative Hunt? No. I don't see anybody else with their hand up. So I guess, do we need to vote on this?
Mr. Chairman, yeah, we need an action to approve the contract.
Okay, is there a motion?
So move.
Senator Dockstader, motion, Senator Anselmi Dalton, second. Any discussion? All in favor? Oh, all in favor, say aye or raise your hand. Looks like it's unanimous to me. Those opposed? I see none. Okay. Director Gephardt?
Okay. Mr. Chairman, the next item on the agenda is Duckwell number 2. This is a small water program project. And what we've recommended to the commission and to select water committee is a change in scope for this project. The original project was to drill a well and provide, I believe, stock water. They could not obtain a permit through BLM to drill a well because CBM presence in the area. So they came up with a new plan that would tap into an existing artesian well and develop a storage tank and a water trough for that. So our recommendation, it does not change the funding amount. It's still a $35,000 grant portion, which is our 50% match. Falls in line with our small water program, but it's just a change of scope for that project. So the director's recommendation is to change the scope for this project.
Are there any questions? I don't see any. I would guess we need to vote on this also.
We would appreciate it, please, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Is there a motion?
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Hunt and Senator Anselmi Dalton seconded. All those in favor, raise your hand. All those opposed? It passed. All right, Director, if
All
we
right.
could go on to the next item.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, next item is the consideration for an MOU between the Office of Water Programs and the Water Development Commission. This is the standard MOU that we've been doing for multiple years. This is a 2-year MOU. If you'll remember, the omnibus bill appropriated $175,000 for the biennium. So this MOU basically spells out that there will be 2 payments to the program, equal amounts of $87,500 per year for a total of $175,000. We just need approval to execute that MOU.
Are there any questions for the director? I do not see any. Is there a motion?
Motion to
Represent-
approve.
Thank you, Representative Blake and Representative Simpson, a second. Any discussion? All those in favor, raise your hand. Those opposed, raise your hand. I did not see any opposed, so that passed. Maybe I did see one opposed. Senator Anselmi Dalton? No, okay. All righty, that passed.
Okay. Mr.
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to continue, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for interrupting.
No, that'd be all right. Thank you, Director.
Okay. The next item is consideration of the University of Wyoming Research Program RFP. And I see that Mr. Greg Kerr was kind enough to join us. So if it's okay with the committee, I would ask for Mr. Mr. Kerr to kind of fill you in on what the RFP is asking.
Mr. Kerr, please. I think you're muted. I think you're still muted.
Push down your space bar.
I'll unmute you. Try it anyway. Nope, that doesn't work. Oh, yep, there you are.
Are we unmuted?
Yep, you're good now.
It was showing here, but here I am. I feel like I'm in the doctor's office because I've been in the waiting room. So
Well, you're up now. Thank you, Mr. Kerr.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to visit briefly with you on the fiscal year 2021 request for proposals that would be passed out to the University of Wyoming research community. Our advisory committee met and discussed the various priorities and topics that are in this RFP. It's basically the background is from last year's RFP with some deletions of priorities and some additions to other priorities. So I assume you have in a notebook, looking at the various areas, we have the enhanced water supply forecasting and water use, which is basically the same as last year's, a few additions to that, but basically the same with those subtopics because it's such a broad area, and the committee and agencies felt that this is a very high priority option for the state of Wyoming. They need information in this area. The second area, protecting public health, again, high priority. The agencies are dealing with this on a continuous basis with many subtopics within that. For instance, the waterborne pathogens. We've funded in the past a project looking at E. coli. There are many other waterborne pathogens that are causing problems in the state of Wyoming. And so we want to leave that out there to see if we can get other proposals to address some of that issue. Also, nutrients are within that RFP. And a new one that's added under that priority is antibiotic pollution. This particular area came up from the conservation districts. There's becoming increased issues with antibiotics in a lot of the waters. So you need information in the state of Wyoming to try and get a handle on some of this antibiotic pollution that's coming up. And then lastly, and still important on our list, is the dam operation and sediment management and transport. We have funded one project in that 2 years ago, and this is continuing issue with broader areas that are included in there. So taken out from last year, some of the groundwater issues and also a conveyance loss, which leaves us with more focused areas here, but broader within those focus areas. So that's our fiscal year 21 to present to you for approval.
Mr. Kerr, can you just remind us on who are on the advisory board? And that'd be great.
Yes, we have 8 members. So I don't forget anyone, I'll go down my list. Jody Pring from the Water Development Office is on our advisory committee, along with Mabel Jones from the Water Development Office. She sits in on our committee also. Jennifer Zygmunt from DEQ is a member. Jim Stafford from the Wyoming State Geological Survey. Kathy Rosenthal from the Wyoming Association of Conservation Districts. Dell Lobb from the Wyoming Game and Fish. Scott McDonald from the Wyoming Department of Ag, and Charlie Ferntelli from the Wyoming State Engineer's Office. And then Cheryl Miller is also from the USGS office. So that consists of our committee members.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Kerr? I see Senator Moniz.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Greg, where on the antibiotic pollution, where's that coming from and how did we determine it was a problem?
Mr. Kerr?
Mr. Chairman, I wouldn't be able to tell you that. That issue has been brought to us from the conservation districts. And I assume it's in, from human waste. This is my assumption. So projects that come in would look definitely at what are the issues and what areas that we can identify those, and then research would follow in that area.
Follow up, Senator Moniz?
I'm good.
Okay. Senator Anselmi Dalton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Kerr. Is it the case that they're going to use that last portion for tracking COVID disease? Is that what they were thinking of, or is that not related at all to those kind of studies like they're doing at Park County?
Mr. Kerr?
Mr. Chairman, I don't believe that that was mentioned in our committee meeting about COVID-19 being in there. I think a lot of that comes from prescription drugs that we find, and you're hearing about this all over the country, how prescription drugs are providing pollution to some of our drinking water supplies. And so I believe it addresses that more.
Follow up,
Thank you, Mr.
Senator Anselmi Dalton. Go ahead.
You're going to be studying it already. I don't see why you wouldn't look to see if
Kind
Am I
of breaking.
frozen?
Yeah, you got froze.
Mr. Chairman, I can answer that, and that it's definitely not eliminated, but certainly can be an issue when the RFP is released, that people could look at that.
Representative Eklund.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just kind of following up on what Mr. Kerr just said, I'm curious why they would single out antibiotics when we have, we hear of all the other pharmaceuticals that seem to end up in the wastewater. Anyway, good to be uphill from a lot of that, but do you have any idea why antibiotics is singled out, or does anybody here know why that's singled out over all the others?
Mr. Kerr?
Mr. Chairman, I do not know why antibiotics, but it seems to be at the top of the list for the districts, that this is what they're hearing about coming forward to us in the state of Wyoming. And so that's why they brought this forward. I don't think it's an intention to eliminate any other type of pollution, but it's an issue that they brought up that they'd like more information on to try and get ahead of it.
Any other questions? Yes, Co-Chair Hicks. I think you're muted. There you
Yeah.
are.
Greg, given the nature of the number of diversity of proposals here, I'm a little bit sensitive to the issue of where we're going to be at financially with the water programs and the water research. It seems like we're asking for a lot of diversity and different proposals here, and I wonder whether we should not narrow those down a little bit. It takes a significant amount of time in some cases to put together a proposal to submit. And I feel like at some point in time, we may be having people do a lot of work to put a proposal together. So did the committee rank those as far as priorities, as what they would prefer to see as far as proposals, or is that just a cumulative list that they've thrown out there that we're now going to seek proposals for?
Mr. Kerr?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. First of all, we have narrowed the RFP down, even though there's diverse areas. We try to get proposals. You know, some of the areas such that we've had in the past, we haven't gotten a single proposal on them. So that's why we decided to take those out for this year and try to narrow down. They have been prioritized. In essence, the number one we have on there, the enhanced water supply forecasting and water use, we received 2 proposals in that area last year. We followed through with recommending one that was approved by the commission, approved by the select water, and then it was removed during the legislative session out of the planning bill. So that is still, and that proposal is still an important area that we'd like to see work done in. So as far as people, you know, it does take a lot of time to put proposals together. Faculty are used to that, and they're used to making changes to make their proposals better and resubmit the next year. So in essence, we have tried to narrow it down for those proposals, but I don't believe that in any of these areas, even though they're that diverse, we're not going to get a huge number of proposals on that. And especially now with the way the university is trying to get geared back up, get students back into campus, we just have to see, this is almost a test, I think, this year of what we're doing with trying to get proposals and back into the research.
Follow up?
Now,
Any other questions? I don't see any. Oh, Director Gephardt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to, I believe it was Representative Ackland's question about looking at things other than antibiotics. Jody pointed out that the RFP does say studies on the types of magnitude of antibiotic and or other medication toxins in Wyoming surface water. So the RFP does ask for additional chemicals, I guess, if you will.
Co-Chair Hicks.
yeah, Greg, just walk us through real quick. I mean, the RFPs are out there. When do we expect those back? And then one other question, for the August meeting, one of the things that I think that the committee over the years has discussed is how, after we fund all these research projects, are they actually being applied, or are they being applied? So one of the things that I would ask you to do is to come back at our August meeting and go back through the last 4 years worth of research projects that have been completed, and then just give us an update as to what those projects were and how they're being utilized. Because that committee that you talked about and made up, it's a lot of it's state and federal agencies that have asked for this research. You know, whether it's forecasting or whatever that is, I just want to get a check for the committee to see that the research is actually being applied once we've completed that research. So if you could give us, you know, I know that probably don't need to go through the ones that are actively still being conducted, but any of those that have been completed in, say, the last 5-year window, if you could give us an update on you know, what the status of that is, and then how that research is being applied within the state of Wyoming, I think would be very beneficial to the committee to have that information.
Mr. Kerr.
Mr. Chairman, we can certainly do that. I think that would be actually beneficial to all of us. And, you know, in the past, we've had presentations by some, as a request by some of the research, and we can certainly do that again. It kind of depends on time, because of the meetings have gotten to be, you know, fairly long, and you have to cover a lot of areas in your work. So, but that's certainly an option also.
So Greg, maybe what we ought to do is, if you can put a list of those projects together that are completed, and what I would say is if you can get that to our LSO staff, And so what I would suggest, committee, that they circulate that, and if there's something that you have a strong interest in, that we could ask those researchers or those state agencies that have asked that for that research to come and present to the committee on how they're using that research, whether it's forecasting or dam release operations, sediment flow, E. coli stuff that we've looked in the past. But I think it would be good for the committee's edification going forward with the program is just to kind of get a feeling as to how that's being applied within the state of Wyoming. Is that something the committee, I guess, would like to take a look at that list and then review it and see if there's something on there that you want to go into in depth? So, Mr. Co-Chair, I just asked, I don't want to waste the committee's time if there's no interest in doing that. So I just asked for a show of hands if they'd like to see that list.
Looks like everyone has raised their hand.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Let's plan on that. Senator Dockstetter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to follow up, I like the idea and the approach from Senator Hicks. Just don't overcomplicate it. Not all of us are Representative Simpson and our water engineers. We just need to be able to understand it.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, for a little clarification on the list, we have currently 55 projects with 6 of those ongoing. The others have been completed, some of those years ago. Would you like the entire list of projects, or just, as Senator Hicks mentioned, the last 4 years? Or
Do you have a preference?
I don't want to, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, I just didn't want to overwhelm you with, 50 some odd projects. So
Do you have a preference, Co-Chair Hicks?
Mr. Co-Chair, I would ask for, what's the pleasure of the committee? 4 years, 5 years, an arbitrary number. Maybe there's something in there that, if it's just a list, Greg, that we could go through there. I don't see any problem with sending the whole list out. I don't think we need the active projects because there's no results yet and we don't know how they would be applied. So, but for the things that are completed, but I would turn it back to the committee and ask what their disposition is.
Any response, committee? Representative Simpson.
Gosh, I think actually just 3 or 4 years of information would be adequate for us, the most current trend.
Should we go with that?
Okay.
Representative Paxton? I would guess it'll
4
be
years
just
is plenty.
Okay. Let's go with that then. Mr. Kerr.
Mr. Chairman, that'd be fine. I just would like to point out that all of these projects are listed on our website, and all of the titles of the projects, their abstracts and final reports are also listed. So they are out there available at Words, our website, and other media areas. So
Thank you. That's we could go there and look real quick too then.
yes, you can see the entire reports and everything that's available from the research projects over the years. And I'll provide a list of the last 3 or 4 years to the committee.
Mr. Kerr, could you just send the link to us, to the
Certainly.
committee? So that might help us.
Certainly. I'll provide
Thank
that, Mr. Chairman. Absolutely.
Thank you. Do we need a motion on this, Director or Gephardt?
Mr. Chairman, yes, please.
Is there any other discussion? If not, is there a motion?
I'll move.
Senator Anselmi Dalton moved, Hunt second. All those in favor say aye. Or raise your hand, sorry. Opposed? Raise your hand. It looks like everyone was in favor. The motion passed. I guess we'll go on to trying to figure out item number 7. It looks like Director Gephardt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a request for a construction amendment for the Casper CY pump station. This project bid originally in 2019, got one bid, is about 130% over. So they did some redesign, went back, rebid it here recently, and the bid still came in high. There were 4 bids. All 4 were fairly close to each other. I believe 12 or 15% disparity between the top and the bottom. That sounds like a pretty good bid to me. I think the price that we got is the value of the project. So we've asked for your approval to use our sponsor contingency fund for an amount for our portion of the overrun in the amount of $643,000 for construction amendment to continue with the project.
Are there any questions? Is there a motion to Co-Chair Hicks?
Yeah, Brandon, any explanation why this came in so much higher than what the anticipated cost was? Do we know why?
Correct.
Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, some of the reasons that were provided to us is there's some difficulties in whether to keep it active or not active, the existing facility active or not active. It's built up on a hill with some tight construction constraints. And then there's concerns that need some geotechnical concerns that need to be addressed as part of the project too. So those were really the main things that we heard. I think that just the amount of time and inflation impacted us some on this too. But just a tough project, it sounds like.
And then follow up, Mr. Co-Chair.
Yes.
Brandon, so if we're gonna use 643,000 out of the sponsors inflation fund, what's the total cost of the project? And then how much does that leave in the sponsors inflation fund?
Director Gephardt?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, the total cost of the project, I don't know what the total cost is because there are some components that aren't program eligible, but our portion of it with the with this amendment and still allowing for a contingency account in the project, we're at just over $2.2 million for this project. And then to your second question, I believe we have about 1 to 1.3 million remaining in that contingency account.
Okay.
Follow up? No. Are there any other questions? Is there a motion to accept this?
I would
Representative
move-
Eklund?
Yes, sir. I'd move to accept this proposal.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor, raise your hand. All those opposed, raise your hand. This passed. We'll go on to the next item, item number 8. Director Gephardt.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. In years past, this would have been more discussion, but this year we received no new applications for the MOA program for the Colorado River Basin, largely because it's out of money. And we're getting very near a new MOU, and Mr. Steve Wolf just sat down, and it's also the next topic on the agenda is an update on the MOA 2. So it's a pretty good segue for Mr. Steve Wolf to give us an update.
Mr. Wolf.
Mr. Chairman, member of the committee, good morning. Yeah, I was asked to provide an update to sort of a new MOA agreement that we are currently in process of trying to execute. For those that might be a little new to the process, I'm going to give a little background of the MOA agreement in general. And you should have a one pager in your binders or your electronic folders that provide a little more details to it. But the original MOA agreement has its roots in the Colorado River Storage Project Act of 1956, and it involves the 4 upper basin states of Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico, as well as the Bureau of Reclamation, the Western Area Power Administration, and the hydropower customers that use the power that's generated by the facilities. We signed the first MOA agreement in 2011. And what that did, it freed up about $161 million to the 4 upper basin states for funds to be used by reclamation, but on projects sanctioned by the states to support water facilities and participating projects owned by the Bureau of Reclamation. Of that 161 million, Wyoming was apportioned about 24.6 million. And to date, we have, I think, 24.3 million of that obligated. So as Director Gebhardt said, we're essentially out of money from the MOA 1 agreement. The reason for sort of both agencies here, the way this thing is administered, the state engineer's office sort of is involved in the interstate administration of the agreement. The water development office and their staff are the ones that put the money on the ground with reclamation engineers, and they manage those projects jointly with reclamation. Although MOA 1 agreement, the current term lasts through 2025, there's been a big desire, mainly from WAPA and the power customers, to renegotiate a new agreement. Because when we do agreements, not only do the states receive money, there's also a reduction in hydropower rates to the customers. And there are a lot of folks in Wyoming that receive power from the Colorado River facilities. So it's a win-win. The state gets money, we get a reduced rate to our hydropower customers. We've been working on this, renegotiating what we call MOA 2 since about the first of the year. And yesterday we basically came up with a final draft agreement, finished the last few issues. So we now have essentially a draft agreement ready to execute, we hope. That agreement frees up a total of $187 million, of which just over 29 million will be available for Wyoming's use by reclamation. The term of that agreement goes from 2021 through 2037. So there's an additional $29 million would become available. And again, the agreement, you don't have to use all MOA funds. It would allow the mix of other water development funds and these MOA funds on projects if so desired, so you can mix and match funds as you need it. The new agreement, we hope to be signed by the end of June, no later than mid-July, and it would become effective October 1st of this year. The one unique thing for Wyoming on this agreement is that the governor has to sign it, while the other 3 states it's signed by essentially their state engineer. Wyoming, the governor needs to sign it, so we have a little longer term process to get this reviewed and signed, and we've started that. We briefed the governor's office a couple months ago that this would be coming. So that's sort of a brief update. Certainly be happy to answer any questions.
Are there, Co-Chair Hicks?
Yeah, Steve, could you go over how the distribution formula, how the percentages of the funding is broken out? Is it based on it doesn't necessarily follow the compact. So is it how much power generation is in each state? So that would be my first question, is how that distribution formula came about.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, Wyoming receives 15.5% of these apportionments. That number is listed in the Colorado River Storage Project Act of 56. It was based partially on our water apportionment, which is 14%, but also had a component that looked at potential irrigated acres in the state. And so that's how we came up with the 15.5%.
Okay, and then Mr. Chairman, just a second question on that. Are those funds only available for BOR project, irrigation projects then, Steve?
Mr. Wolf?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, yes, that is correct, that they are available to be used on participating projects of the Colorado River Storage Project Act that are owned by Reclamation. For Wyoming, that includes State Line, Meeks Cabin, Fontanelle, Big Sandy, and Eden Valley. So those dam reservoirs and the project systems related to those reservoirs are eligible for funding.
Could you go through that list again, please?
I'm looking at water development, Mr. Chairman, to make sure I've got it complete. State Line and Meeks Cabin, Fontanelle, Big Sandy, and Eden Valley. Those are the reclamation facilities, reclamation projects within Wyoming, or that have at least part of their facilities within Wyoming.
That's my understanding.
Follow up? Any other questions? Senator Driscoll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back to the allocation of the 15.7, and this is power generation. Is there anything taken into account of the water that's not used? Wyoming obviously puts water in the dam that generates most of the rest of them use the water going up. Do we have any kind of credit we get for that? Because this is always what we get thrown back to us on the Colorado River is we get these power credits. Now we're finding out, one, there's strings attached, and two, I question where several 100,000 acre feet or more our water get there uninhibited. That's actually what's generating the power. The other states are using it. Are we getting any credit for any of that?
Mr. Wolf?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Driscoll, again, the 15.5% that we received was a negotiated amount that is contained in the Colorado River Storage Project Act. All the discussion elements of that, it occurred long ago, and I don't know. To my knowledge, it's essentially based on partially on our apportionment of water in the Colorado River Basin, as well as the potential for irrigated acres. This language is contained in something called aid to irrigation. When the act was originally passed, the funds were to be originally used to help develop irrigation in each of the states. As sort of the development of new irrigation slowed down, we couldn't spend these monies. So essentially what the MOA 1 agreement did was it changed some of the criteria, made it easier for the states to use the money, and then gave power customers a break. So it's sort of a renegotiation of how the funds were intended to use back in 1956.
Follow up?
Yes, Senator Driscoll.
I get that, but isn't the whole point of redoing the MOUs or the MOAs to renegotiate what they do, basically? I guess to me, it looks, I think it's a little like a lot of other deals. We didn't make a very great deal a long time ago. I'm not sure we should keep following it.
Mr. Wolf?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Driscoll, well, to your point, one thing that I think all parties agreed to when we did this agreement back in 2010, 2011, was that we would not go in and amend the Colorado River Storage Project Act. I think everybody was very adamant we did not do that. So this is kind of a side agreement relative to the act itself. So at the time, there's no way we could go in and change those percentages. I understand your point, but I don't think there was any way we were going to go and change those percentages on the apportionments.
Co-Chair Hicks?
Yeah, quick question, Steve, and I guess for Brandon too, is there right now BOR is participating in the weather modification program in the Wind Rivers. And most of all these projects are a component other than you get over to Meeks Cabin. I think one of those State Line may be on the Bear River drainage. I can't remember, but certainly Eden Valley, Big Sandy, Fontanelle. Is there any discussion or any thoughts of using those MOA funds if we're gonna continue a weather mod program in the Wind River Range, to use those instead of general or regular water development funds?
Mr. Wolf?
Mr. Chairman, I think Barry Lawrence from Water Development could answer that better.
Mr.
Mr.
Chairman,
Lawrence?
Mr. Chairman, Barry Lawrence. Yes, in the early years, several years ago, the Bureau of Reclamation participated in some of the research that we were doing there. They were not interested at that time in participating in operations. We did take a run at it a few years back, and Steve, you may remember what year that was. I'm not sure. It was maybe 5 years ago or so. 2014, that we did try to get MOA funds to do operations in the Wind River Range, and that was declined. They decided not to do that.
Thank you. That's good. That's good to know.
Senator Driscoll?
Thank you. Yeah, that is good to know. I'd like to get a listing of all the projects we funded and how we funded them under this initial MOA. Looks to me like we're getting boxed into where we get to spend our own money the way they want us to spend it. I still am a little foot draggish on whether we ought to be entering into this at this point in time.
Mr. Wolf?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Driscoll, I can at least off the top of my head give you a general of how we've spent our money. We did some work on the dam apron at State Line Dam. In fact, they're handing it to me right now. We operate, there are a couple stream gauges that were important to the state that were discontinued by USGS below some reservoirs. We continue to operate those gauges using MOA funds. We've applied some to Eden Valley Salinity Control Project as well. And I think the big one that's probably eaten up about 2/3 of the money is the Big Sandy project that is ongoing right now. Am I missing something? Those are the main ones that I'm aware of.
Senator Dockstader?
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Big Sandy, how much longer do you anticipate on that?
Mr. Wolf?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Dockstader, I'd have to ask Jason Beed. He's the project manager on that one.
Mr. Mead?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, the Bureau is going through the final steps of the environmental assessment currently. The final design is complete, bids or plans and specs are put together, and if the record of decision is favorable, which we are expecting, that they'll be going out to bid later this fall and have a contract by the end of the year. So it should go to construction here right around the first of the year on the enlargement.
Senator Driscoll?
And what are the percentages on the enlargement? Who's paying what? I get that we're funding it, but who's paying and what percentages?
Mr. Mead?
Mr. Chairman, that's 100% funded through MOA.
It's 100% through MOA, okay.
Yep.
And then follow up.
Yes.
Eden Valley, that you talked about the salinity project, we're using our MOA funds to dry up acres in Wyoming, is that correct?
Mr. Wolf?
Mr. Chairman, those projects are more for canal linings and conveyance improvements for Eden. They've done a good job of basically converting ditches to pipelines. It's not taking lands out of production, it's improving efficiencies.
Yes,
Senator Driscoll?
Very good, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, the only thing I was going to add is I think for Eden Valley, we've been able to use salinity control money, water development funds, as well as MOA funds for a fairly large project. So a mixture of funds to put that project on the ground.
Any other questions? I think we just had a report. Is that all we had to do on this one, Director Gephardt?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
I'll ask one more time. Any more questions? All right, we'll go on to the next item, number 10.
Mr. Chairman, this is just an update. This spawned in the legislative session, one of our projects, the Sheridan Municipal Watershed Wildfire Hazard Mitigation Project. We had an amendment or a second phase to that project. And that project was removed from our recommendations, and we were asked to communicate with the State Forestry Division on ways that we can efficiently do that or partially do those studies in-house. We had a conversation with the state forester, and since that time, he has become very busy with COVID and gearing up for the fire season. So the latest that we heard from Mr. Crasper was that generally, yes, they felt that these studies could fall in their purview and they could be done. He did mention that he felt like he would have to have additional staff beyond what he has now to complete these. And he made the comment that even with that it's possible that he would have to subcontract some portions of these types of studies out. I just wanted to give you an update on that. The conversations aren't done. We intend to continue those conversations and get better idea. But because of his workload and some of the situations that he's dealing with right now, those kind of have stalled for the interim time. So just providing an update.
Co-Chair Hicks.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I had a fairly lengthy conversation with the state forester and pretty consistent, similar to what Brandon said. I think where we're headed with this based on my conversations is certainly he felt like they had the expertise to do the review on the fuels models and some of the wildfire stuff. He did indicate to me that he did not have the staff capacity to actually put the report together in a format. Where I think that we may end up heading with this is that when these applications come into water development, they're actually submitted to State Forestry Division for review, and then we're going to end up with a hybrid program. And State Forestry will review what they can and can't do as far as putting together these wildfire hazard mitigation programs, and then work with water development on what they would need to complete those. So I do think that we're going to find some efficiencies here. My conversations with the state forester, certainly they have the expertise to do all the modeling and the fires. He just didn't feel like to put the overall document in place was something that would probably be beyond their capacity. So I still think there's going to be some cost savings, but I would envision in the future that Director Gephardt, that as we receive those, that your office would work directly with the state foresters to go through those applications and then make a determination as to what they could provide and then what they would still require. And then maybe that would then be what we would go out and look for a consultant to take all of that information instead of charging us for the information that they're getting from the state forester right now. It will actually should reduce the cost of these and increase the efficiencies. But I think that's probably in my conversations where I think we want to head with this. And so that all of these would be reviewed and input working with water development staff and state forestry rather versus just going out and hiring a consultant. So Director, I conveyed that to the state forester, that I commend you guys for working together and looking at this. Hopefully we can get a little more update at our August meeting, but yeah, keep up the good work with the state forester Crapser on that.
Representative Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate what Senator Hicks just said. I concur with that. It doesn't make sense to me to add one or two more employees. I'm told that a typical employee with benefits is around $100,000. If you had one or two, all of a sudden it costs us more to do it in-house than it is outside. But if we can do a collaborative effort, so we involve more of the state forestry's existing personnel to minimize the scope for the consultants, we can certainly cut down on the costs there. So I appreciate the efforts. I think it was a wise decision to postpone that Sheridan for 1 year. But in regards to our commitment to the Sheridan folks and those folks north of Sheridan, I think we'll need to put it back on the list for next year, but let's take advantage of the State Forestry Department. Thank you.
Director Gephardt?
Mr. Chairman, thanks for the comments, and yeah, we'll continue to work through that and find the most efficient way to conduct these studies.
All right, any other questions on this item? Okay, we'll go on to item number 11.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, thank you. This is just kind of an ongoing update to kind of a hot topic in the state right now, at least in our world, and that's the La Perelle Irrigation District dam rehabilitation. If you'll remember at the last meeting, the Commission and Select Water Committee approved a contract amendment to continue the work. At that time, we did not have a scope, so the approval just basically gave us the authorization to refine and develop the scope to continue on. I'll report that we are very near, probably within a week of executing that amendment. We've worked diligently with the consultants. They've been a great help in helping us to find the path forward. And it sounds to me like we could have drill rigs to do some geotechnical work within the month. So we're kind of hitting the ground running on that and trying to progress and see what the solution is for that problem. I'll stand for any questions.
Are there any questions? Does not look like it. All right, we'll continue on to item 12.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, this again is another update, requires no action. This is the emergency fund that was recently passed, emergency projects account. We are in the process of drafting some emergency rules that will be put into place by July 1st, which is the date of the bill. And we're progressing quite well. I'll just kind of throw out some of our thoughts, our overarching thoughts on the way we're developing these rules and what we think the intent of the bill is and how we're focusing on that. So we don't think that the intent of the bill is to be a rehab account in any means. So the intent of the bill is to address the immediacy of a situation when it arises, put boots on the ground, try to address it, but not necessarily to remain intact throughout the whole rehab and making something new. So it's kind of trying to define where this starts and stops, what's eligible, what's not. And so we're working through that within the rules. The other thing is act of God. What causes the failure or imminent failure? And then what is imminent failure? Those are some things that really need refined and how we determine if something is eligible or not. Again, keeping it out of deferred maintenance or rehab type of a situation, and truly the intent of dealing with an emergency that nobody could have known about. Something happens and we need to react quickly and put money and boots on the ground. So that's where we are right now. We will take a draft. The draft we're working through right now. We'll work through the commission. We've got a special meeting on June 11th with the commission to work through that and get their approval on that. And then we'll have to go through AG approval as well as ultimately the governor's review. So that's where we are on the rules for that project. Jan, for any questions?
Director Gephardt, I guess I would sure hope the select water is involved with the rules before it goes too far in case we have some issues. And I would think the committee would think the same. So I don't know how will we go about that?
Mr. Chairman, is it too unreasonable to include you in the June 11th special meeting?
I would think that would be proper, and I hope the rest think the same. Are there any questions for Director Gephardt on this? Representative Simpson.
Mr. Chairman, yeah, my memory is going to be exposed here to you, but I cannot recall the seed money to start this fund. We bounced it back and forth in the legislature 150 times. What was the final? Did we take this money out of Water Development Account number 1, or did it come out of general fund? Where did this money come from?
Mr. Chairman.
Director Gephardt.
Representative Simpson, 2.5 million came from Water Development Account 1, and 2.5 million came from, I believe, the special projects funds of the SIPA funds. Is that correct, Mr. Hicks?
Correct.
Thank you. So 50-50.
Any other questions? All right. We'll go on to item, got to go to the next page, item 13.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, the next item, this is the intended use, the IUP for the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. And what we're asking the committee on this, as part of that program, statute 16-1-303, blah, 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 had asked for Select Water Committee to review and recommend approval to State Loan and Investment Board for its final authorization and adoption of this IUP. And I've got Mr. Wade Verplanke, if you'd come up here so you can hear. He could, whether you want a presentation or ask any questions, I'll turn it over to Mr. Verplanke.
Mr. Planke.
Yes, as we've done in the past, we've sent this out for review. Typically, there's not much in it. It's just a list. The projects are prioritized by health risks mostly, and by who needs the help the most. But it is not a list of who we're going to help. It is a list of who we could help. The number 1 project has never came in to request help, so they will probably be bypassed, as others will be.
Mr. Chairman, I might just add that the intent of this list is, in order to qualify for these funds, they have to file to be placed on this list, the intended use list. And I don't remember what the dates were, but they have to be on this list in order to be eligible for this funding. And so that is the reason we have the list. That doesn't mean that they're going to maybe request anything, but they've got to be on the list to even request something. So it's an extensive list, and it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody on that list is going to request funding.
Co-Chair Hicks.
Yeah, either for Wade or Brandon, either one. Just for my edification, I don't remember. So what's the contribution rate? Part of it's federal funds, and then there's a little bit, my recollection, that comes out of state funds. And then what's the interest rate that's currently charged on the SWC funds right now?
Okay, the amount of money is 20% state, 80% federal. The 20% is split between water development and state lands. We are currently only taking every other grant from the federal government. We are skipping the even years. That was a decision made by SLIB. The interest rate is currently 2.5%, And we can usually do 20 years, but they can request 50 years.
Follow up?
Follow up there, question on some of our municipal projects that we've done through water development that were also on the, have we used water development funds to match SRF funds?
Yes, most of the projects that are about half of the projects are funded by water development, and then the matching money is coming from the SRF for the loan. The smaller little projects for water meters and stuff like that are funded 100% by the SRF.
All right. You just, you know, for the committees, just going forward, I think that we need to look at moving as many of these projects. And I know just conversations with the governor, certainly that's his intent, is to move as many and as much of the funding over to SRF and away from water development as we possibly can. So it may get into a discussion, a broader discussion of cost share rates. So, you know, 80% federal, 20% state. Anyway, just moving forward, I think that'll be an issue that we want to look at as we get more demands and less funding for the program through water development.
Representative Simpson.
Just a general comment for you, for your information. When I was in the consulting world, I can't tell you how many times that small water districts or small towns would come to me as a consultant and say, oh, I've got a real problem. I need your help to fix this. And I'd go to the intended use plan and their name was nowhere to be found. And it was a source of frustration for those smaller communities. But with that said, I fully support the intended use priority list. It's redone annually, so it's not like it's a one and done and you're out for years, but it requires our water system operators to be thinking in advance and stop letting things just break and that they know they're going to break, but it requires them to be thinking in advance. I think it's a good program. I love the list. It really helps quantify how important and prioritize our water systems throughout the state. And it gives us as managers an idea of what's coming up too. It helps us financially prepare with budgets. So I appreciate DEQ and this program. Thank you.
Co-Chair Hicks.
Yeah, Mr. Co-Chair, and I think Representative Simpson brings up a good point. And along that line, if you remember 2 years ago or a year and a half ago on the budget, the governor had an exception request to put an engineering position in the Office of State Lands and Investments specifically to start working with these smaller communities to direct them towards other sources of funding. So those applications didn't just come through SLIB and the MRG program to start tapping into RUS, SRF, and these other programs. So I'm just thinking that maybe to get to Representative Simpson's issue of not having those smaller communities, in our August meeting, we may want to ask the individual that was hired in that position that now sits in the Office of State Lands and Investment to come to the committee and give us an update on how that program is working, if they have reached out to all these small rural water districts to get them onto the IUP, and just get an update to the committee on how that position's working. It's a little broader than just water, but certainly that was the intent, was to try to use that position to help those smaller communities to get those applications filled out. So I would just ask the committee if that's something that they would like to bring that individual in for an update on how that program's working and how they're interfacing with DEQ and water development and SLIB. We certainly want to encourage them to use the SRF, RUS before they just run to MRGs through SLIB or water development. So what's the disposition of the committee? Would you like an update on that?
I think, let's raise our hands if you would like that. I think that's a good idea. Most of us have raised our hands, so I think if we could get Abigail to do that, that would be great. I'm
Mr.
guessing,
Chairman,
yes,
just
Director
for reference,
Gephardt.
that individual in state lands name is Keenan Hendon. Just to help Abigail.
Thank you, Director Gebhardt, and I'm listening. You just can't see my face.
Thank you, Abigail. All right, are there any other questions on this item? All right, I think if Co-Chair Hicks thinks the same, I think we should take a break for, let's just be back at about, let's go 9:55. Give us 10 minutes.
Mr.
Is that
Chairman,
enough?
Mr.
Yes,
Chairman.
Director Gephardt, you got some more?
No, but we need an action on that if you wouldn't mind. We need your review and recommend approval to state loan on the intended use plan, please.
Okay, okay, is there a motion of such? Senator Dockstetter? Is there a second? Representative Eklund? Any discussion? All in favor of the intended use plan? Raise your hand. Those against? That passed. Anything else, Director Gephardt?
Mr. Chairman, that's it for right now. Thank you.
Let's just make it, oh, anything else from the committee? Co-Chair Hicks.
Mr. Co-Chair, you're doing such a fine job chairing this committee. I'll just let you chair the rest of the remaining agenda, if you don't mind.
Okay, if that works for you, we'll thank
Absolutely.
you. Okay, let's just go for 10 o'clock. We'll take a break. Everybody mute your microphones and stop your video. Well, it looks like it's 10 o'clock. We have a quorum here, it looks like. I need to ask Co-Chair Hicks if we had some presentations. It looks like the first item of business is small water program criteria. Is that how we want to proceed? Up, I think you're muted.
Mr. Co-Chair, that's the way it's outlined in the agenda, unless there's any objections or somebody that's got a schedule that we need to facilitate. I would say let's just proceed. I do have, before we jump in there, Mr. Co-Chair, just as a heads up, I want to add a couple of things to the agenda. One of them, I was hoping that Representative Hunt, and I know you're on the Joint Ag Committee, there was some discussion about changing distribution formula of the mineral severances between account 1 and account 2. So if we could put that on the agenda, maybe Representative Hunt could give us an update on that. And then we could have a little discussion with the director on his thoughts and the committee. And then the second thing that I would like to add to the agenda on that is just an FYI information about a bill that passed out of Congress, not Congress, but it passed out of the Senate EPW committee, which Senator Barrasso chairs, and on water infrastructure bill. And like to give the committee an update on that and the implications for Wyoming, and then ask Director Gephardt for an update on information the Water Development Office may have supplied associated with that discussion. So those two agenda items I would like to add on before future meeting schedule if we can.
Okay, we'll have a little discussion on those items after we go through the other four.
All right, thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure if Josh was going to help us out, or Abigail, on the small water program criteria, or is someone else taking the lead on this? Co-Chair Hicks.
Yeah, Mr. Co-Chair. So after the session, there was an amendment on the the water bill, the omnibus water bill that came out of the Senate. And one of the things that that became apparent is there's some discussions as to what we want to do with the small water project coming forward. And there was a little bit difference of view between what the Senate's thoughts were and the House thoughts were. So just to refresh everybody's memory on that, the Senate had actually put some more money into that program. And I think the discussion with some of the House members was maybe we need to go back and the House didn't want to add the funds. We went to conference committee on that bill. I think Representative Simpson was on that conference committee with me. So we ended up with this on as interim topic assigned by Management Council. Really, committee, I think what we need to have is a discussion at this point in time. It's just a discussion. Some of the thoughts were the program keeps growing. I think there was roughly a 20-some% increase in applications, maybe a little more than that in the last year, as to whether we want to cap the amount of funding for the small water program. That would be one option. The other option would be to go back in and visit the priorities under the last administration, under the Governor Mead's water plan. They expanded the type of projects that would be eligible for the small water project program. But so when we get through this interim, I would hope that we have some direction from the committee, and then working with the commission do we want to cap the funding? Do we want to go back and revisit the prioritization And if you revisit the prioritization, you may have to go into the criteria. And if we have a recommendation or suggestion working through the commission, they would have to go back and go through their rulemaking process if they wanted to amend that criteria. So for right now, Mr. Co-Chair, and for the committee, I think the real question for the committee, and I know there is might be some people wanting to weigh in this on the public comment side also, Mr. Co-Chair, is just what I would do is just kind of run through the committee and ask people's opinion as to what they think, you know, where do we want to go with the small water project program? Do we want to continue to fund it if all the projects that they come in? Do we want to cap it? Do we want to revisit the criteria and narrow the eligibility for those projects? So just to capture the discussions coming out of the legislative session, I would say what I would like to do is just ask each one of the select water committee members is the direction that they think we may want to go with the program.
I think if Director Gephardt could help us here, I'm not sure if he has the information available and such. How much of the funding is in there, and maybe or how much is our limit right now? Maybe Chair Hicks has that right offhand. And can you give us kind of an idea how the prioritization goes?
Mr. Chairman, if that question is directed to me, I can start.
That would work.
Okay. So the way the applications and the recommendations work currently is because of the timing and everything, we make a projection of how many projects we think we're going to receive. And just to help clarify what the point Mr. Hicks was making, we had a 40% increase last year in applications. We've seen the trend upwards over the last 5 years or so. And when we made our projection, I believe we projected 90. That we would accept 90 that we would receive 90 applications, and we ended up receiving 115 applications. So that probably was the emphasis for a lot of the discussion on what we're going to do with that and what we're funding this year, and a lot of that discussion. So that's how we got to, I think, this topic is there was a lot of discussion and what we're going to fund and what we recommend to fund. So that's kind of how we got here. And just so the committee knows, once we received all of those applications and we were afraid that maybe we wouldn't have, let me back up. So when we make that projection, that is what we put in the omnibus bill to request money. And when we're doing that, we have not fully vetted those applications to know what are eligible, what aren't, and really hadn't had a chance to look at our prioritization of those projects yet. So as the omnibus bill is going through legislation, we're in the background looking at that and doing our evaluation and assigning priorities to it. It just so happened that we received enough in reversions and our previous accounts that with just a little bit of tweaking on those funding appropriations, we were able to appropriate funding for all eligible applicants. So that's how we got this year done. Now going forward, that may not be the case because we had a significant amount of carryover money from previous years as well as reversions to get us to that. This year, I wouldn't anticipate that we will have that ability because we have appropriated we have funded all of the money that's been appropriated to the program. So going forward, I do think that if we were to receive the same amount, I think we would probably be coming back to you asking for the neighborhood of $3 million in appropriation to fund the same amount of projects that we received this year. possibly even
Mr.
more.
Mr. Director, so is that about where we were? To remind us, were we near that 3 million?
Mr. Chairman, we ended up funding about that, but we only requested, I believe, $1 million for account one and 701, 795. 201, 795 is the number that sticks in my head on top of the 50,000 original. So we appropriated in new money about 1.7 between the two programs, but that what we actually funded because of money left over was significantly more, and I believe it was in the neighborhood of close to $3 million in small water programs between the two accounts.
So on those that after you evaluated them, were some of them could not qualify? And is there kind of a percentage of those of the 105? And also, or did they ask for more money than they actually needed?
Mr. Chairman, to answer your question, of the 115 applications, 3 of the applications did not qualify per the rules of the program. And to answer your question, I believe on why we had money left over, there are multiple reasons. The previous year, I think we had a carryover because of when the program was initiated and through the years, we kept getting seed money and asking for money and maybe not appropriated projects to all the money that we had. Plus we get reversions. There are instances where some of these projects do not get built. So those will get turned back to us, as well as maybe not needing the full funding. I'll also remind you that the maximum amount we will fund for any project is $35,000. And that's a 50-50 grant. So the project's got to be at least $70,000 for us to fund the 35. Otherwise that ratio goes down. And also to expand on that, when we're asking for this appropriation from legislature, we don't know what that number really, the final number is going to be. So we may assume that we get 100 applications and they're all going to be $35,000. So that's what we ask for in the appropriation. But when they actually come in, they may only ask for 10,000. So that money historically had gone back into just the account and would be used in future years. But after this funding cycle, we basically tapped into all of the reversions and backlog money that we have. So,
Mr. Director, can you remind me the timing of these applications, and did we change the timing recently? And if not, can we change the timing?
Mr. Chairman, the applications are due January 1, which kind of falls right in the middle of the legislative session. As far as changing the application date, I think that's probably doable. Barry, do you have thoughts on that?
Could move it up a little bit. Yeah.
We can move it up a little bit, I think, and allow us time to vet it out before we ask for money.
Does that require to get it notified out in the public rules or such?
Criteria.
It'd be criteria, Mr. Chairman, so it'd have to go through the criteria process.
Is that lengthy?
No, it's not terrible. And I would just throw out too, depending on how we decide, or if we decide to cap this, if we just cap the funding, then maybe it's a non-issue. We know what we're going to have for funding, and then we just on the backside we use our priorities to determine which ones would get funded or not. So kind of let's see how it goes and what needs to be done with the application date.
Okay, thank you. Co-Chair Hicks, I saw you had your hand up.
Mr. Co-Chair, you had the exact same question I did, is even if we move the application deadline up to December 1st, that would still have a number available by the time, even on the budget years or the non-budget years for the supplemental, to have a real number of what their request was. to get into the omnibus water bill. So it would just be changing it from January 1st to December 1st to 30 days, would afford us that opportunity to know what the request was. And so I think that would probably be a good move, irregardless of whether we cap it or not, because even if we cap it and we have requests that come in substantially under that, it would free up some money for other programs that come out of account 1 and account 2. So that would be my recommendation to Brandon to take back to the commission to look at just moving that application deadline up 30 days.
So, Mr. Chairman, this. is
Comments,
Brandon.
Director?
Yeah, I apologize for my ignorance, but when does session start on non-budget years?
Usually second week in July or second week in January.
Okay,
July.
thank you. So
Any
one
other
month-
comments, Director?
Yep, I think moving it up 1 month would give us enough time to get an idea of what we're bringing forward.
I agree with Co-Chair Hicks that we should bring that forward to the commission. Representative Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee members, I was really frankly surprised at how many legislators came to me during the session last year and said, why are we spending so much money on water? What is the big deal? Clearly, those representatives and senators do not value water like we do. But given that question, that there are many out there that are going to say, why don't you cut your program back? I'm very sensitive about going into this legislative year where we're going to be slashing many budgets across the boards. I think that it's prudent on our part to do some things to represent that we're being frugal and cautious with the use of our water funds, so that we can get up on the floor and say, we're already doing the following things already to try to be fiscally prudent. I'd hate to go back. We have a great program with our large projects, and I really don't want to scrutinize that, but I am concerned about the significant ballooning of this program. I would suggest to you that this is one of the areas that we need to trim back, and that is by restricting, maybe creating a more stringent criteria, perhaps by maximizing the amount of money we're going to pay out. Maybe 35,000, rather than funding fewer projects, maybe we ought to reduce the number by, I'm going to throw the number out, by 10,000. Let's make it a $25,000 max, and then thereby letting more people be funded. But I guess my suggestion to the committee would be, let's ask the director to think that over in the next month or two about how we might scrutinize and pull this program back a little bit, that we can demonstrate to the rest of the legislators that we are in fact trying to be fiscally wise. I think for a conservation district to have to wait an extra year before his projects come on to move up on the list is a very acceptable approach for us. So that would be my recommendations to the committee, Mr. Chairman.
Co-Chair Hicks.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and just to build on that, and I don't know that we need to make a decision on this right now to get to Representative Simpson. I can just tell you there is a lot of talk that there could potentially be a giant raid on water development. That is already being discussed. It's been discussed to a certain level within Management Council. It's certainly prevalent. On your side of the House, Representative Simpson. I think before we just say, let's take this program, I think when this comes through, we'll know more when we get through this special session, if we have a special session to do the budget. I had forwarded on to you guys some information from Don Simpson to the committee. I want you to take a careful review of that prior to the special session. because that will be the major item for discussion so if you look at what we call the under the cap severance tax and those programs that are funded on that $155 million that are under the cap and that distribution formula, you need to get familiar with that, because I agree we have to have some level of parity if we're going to start reducing programs across the board. That's where the reduction will probably likely come from, will be the overall funding. But once we see what that may or may not look like, the real question is it's going to be a global view of water development as to how we get those reductions. And so I think right now it'd be very premature to say, let's just pick small water and cap it, when we're going to have to look at everything. And we're going to have to work with the commission and the people of the state of Wyoming to identify, what are those really important things? What are the absolutely essentials that we need? But first we need to understand the magnitude of the reductions and where those reductions are coming and how they look like. So I do think Representative Simpson, in the bigger sense of we're going to have to look at something, is absolutely correct. It's going to come through most likely the under the cap distribution formula for those mineral severance taxes. Those are the ones the legislature has direct authority to go in there and change those percentages or reduce the cap. It may go from 155 million, the percentages stay the same. There is a lot of, I think Representative characterized a lack of understanding on the importance of water overall within the legislature. And that's something that's incumbent upon this committee to continue to provide that education. But as far as right now making a decision, I think what I would prefer to do specific to this is just have the discussion of what's on the table. And then at our August meeting, my hopes were, after we look at what we are budgetary, have more clarity as to what that looks like, and then start looking at all the programs within water development. But just, I wanted this on here. We talked about this after the session, and also get some public input and then the feedback from the committee. And I think I understand where Representative Simpson's coming from, but certainly there's going to be a lot bigger look than just small water when we get into this. So with that, Mr. Co-Chair, I would turn it back. I kind of got off onto the more global picture, but there's things moving out there.
Thank you for the update and the information. Are there some more questions? Looks like Senator Moniz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not so much a question as a comment to follow up on Senator Hicks's comments. He's obviously intimately involved with what they're looking at here, but as he said, on the House side there, the water accounts have been a place where House Appropriations seems to like to raid the finances. So I think we want to be careful about being too frugal here, because we can be frugal and then they're going to be more frugal when they go to look at it. So I would agree. I think we want to be careful here going forward with this.
Thank you. Representative Hunt.
Mr. Chairman, I didn't have anything to add on that. Thank you.
Okay, I thought I saw your hand. Is there any other discussion? Senator Doxter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I expressed my concerns too about what's coming over the horizon that we may not see. With that said, maybe a little follow-up from Representative Simpson, where he came from with that 25 number, as we kind of throw that back into the director's chair to kind of look at. But yeah, we got to be a little careful. We've had some Rob, Peter, and Paul scenarios in the past. Some Senate fingerprints are on that too. We got to be careful. It's desperate times out there, and let me tell you, they're going to be looking for money in a lot of different places. So a word of caution.
Representative Eklund.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So that raid has already happened. You know, a couple years ago, we had the state engineers, regulators put into the mix too. So it's kind of the same thing as raiding what looked like a flush account. And it also demonstrated a lack of understanding of how Wyoming has operated these two programs, one regulatory and one development, and more education by the House members it's hard to do because everybody has their specialty. And I was surprised that joint appropriations did that without an understanding of why they're separated.
Senator Driscoll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I think there's no doubt the traditional raids are going to happen. We've been forewarned and it's there, and it's been a go-to account forever. What's new this time, in my opinion, that's much different is we have a move by leadership in the House to de-earmark the funding that flows in. Senator Hicks sent out a chart of how our funding comes in, and I happen to know for a fact they're looking very closely at de-earmarking the funding, and that totally changes how water would be funded at that point if that happened, because they're going to have to come to appropriations every year to fight for their money off a normal budget. I think at all costs, we need to make sure that we stay intact on the funding on this committee and the select water. We also probably need to get proactive and talk about who uses the water and who benefits from it, or the money, because a vast majority of our money, if you ask people out in the public, they'll tell you it goes to farmers and ranchers. And we need to get across that the city of Casper, the city of Cheyenne, and virtually every city in Wyoming understands the consequences if we pull the funding out of this thing, because in truth, this is probably one of the very biggest subsidy programs we have for our cities and towns out there. Is we finance huge parts of their infrastructure for them. And if that goes away, it is a unfunded mandate on them. And we need to basically man to man through the House and Senate. We need to activate WAM and the county commissioners and tell them to get out there and start pushing this, because if this funding goes, they're going to be digging out of their pots to figure out how to fund projects. It's not just irrigation, and that's going to require all the way across the board, I think, a re-education everybody of what it really, really does. Thank you.
I have to definitely agree with that, Senator Driscoll. I've been in the House trying to push that item big time with WAM and the county commissioners, and as a group, we need to keep pushing that. The cities get a major portion of water account one. I'm pretty sure. I'm guessing around 80% or even more, and so I think that's we need to educate them a little bit more and make sure they're pushing us. Co-Chair Hicks.
Yeah, and before we move off of the back to the small water and to kind of address some of Representative Simpson's concerns, you guys are aware we do a lot of small water projects down here in my neck of the wood, but I want to tell you a little bit about the economic impact of those. So just yesterday, I had the opportunity to go out and we advertised for bid 7 stock ponds, and we had 6 contractors show up. These are guys that have 1 or 2 pieces of equipment. In one case, one guy owns a bulldozer and he wants to, he needs revenue, but even then, so this is money that goes right back into the community to those really small contractors. Give you an example. We will hire a contractor to go out and build a stock pond. We buy the pipe for the stock contractor from a local retailer that sells PVC pipe. So they make money. When we drill a water well, we use a contractor out of Lander. He buys his casings from Wyoming Water Well Works in Casper. We use a local contractor to then do the plumbing and stuff on that. So we've all heard the pontifications and the bloviating about the capital construction projects and how important it is that the state spend money to keep our contractors working. You know, it's one thing to go build a building at the university and have an out-of-state contractor come in here. That's all wonderful to spend $200 million over there. You know, I'm just telling you the impact and the discussions that I've had with the governor in a time of economic hard times, especially in our smaller communities with the dry up of the oil and gas industry, that sometimes these small water projects are the only thing out there to keep these guys paying their taxes and keeping a few people on the payroll. It has a huge economic impact in rural communities and agricultural communities all over the state of Wyoming. You want to put people to work in rural Wyoming? I don't know a better program in the state of Wyoming. And so more than anything else right now, while we're developing water for wildlife and livestock and public recreation for this program, really big component of us is keeping people working. And that's why I would be reluctant to go in and start any major cuts or reductions. You know, I understand that everybody's got to suffer a little pain, but this program is pretty damn important to those little contractors and those retail sales guys all over the state of Wyoming.
Thank you. Senator Dockstader.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Senator Chairman Hicks has done a good summary, but one key point there. We move out to those little small rural communities. This is key to not only sustaining their infrastructure, their systems and all of that, but rather than just throw blank checks at them like some of the other programs we're saying here, do a good job, deliver a product, deliver a service, deliver a final project with this money. And at the same time, we've employed people in the small rural areas and we've helped these small communities, these small districts. We get lost sometimes in the bigger, larger areas. This is an opportunity to go small and help in the rural areas.
Any other comments? I need to ask Co-Chair Hicks. So do we want to get the director to come with some information on what effects we might have on cutting it to 25, or give us an idea of criteria, maybe how that works, prioritizing the projects and such?
Mr. Co-Chair and committee members, I don't have any predisposition one way or another. This was just something that came out of the session that I thought deserved a little discussion, maybe between now and the August meeting. If we were inclined, here's what I would suggest, Mr. Co-Chair. Let's wait till we get through this budget cycle and see what the global thing is going to look like, and maybe take this back up in August. We will have August, then we're going to have a November meeting. If there was something that required legislation. The other thing is I think we need to engage the commission in this discussion. But at some point in time, I think this was no more than to get it up and get people thinking about, you know, what. And unfortunately, between the session and now, we all know what's happened to the economy, state's budget, and all of that. Also, I wanted to get it out there, Mr. Co-Chair, members of the committee, and maybe solicit more input from the public on what their thoughts are before we just started making recommendations of cutting, capping criteria, and also have that discussion with the commission and get their thoughts. So more than anything else, what I was hoping that this would just be an information sharing. I do know, like I see that Bobby Frank with the Wyoming Association of Conservation Districts is logged in. So with that, Mr. Co-Chair, unless the committee's got some other direction they'd like to go, I think we just put this on the August agenda and keep work in that direction, and hopefully after, if we have a special budget session, this may just be a small piece of a bigger issue that we have to grapple with.
Thank you, Co-Chair. I think I might open it up to Bobby Frank to see. I think this is probably the topic she wanted to comment on, if that's okay with committee.
Mr. Co-Chair, I see Senator Moniz has his hand up, if he'll unmute himself.
Oh, Senator Moniz.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. I have a question and maybe a comment for Brandon. How much is left in the Buffalo Bill account?
Mr. Chairman, I believe currently about 13 million is left in the Buffalo Bill account.
And a question for Senator Hicks to follow up on that.
That would be okay.
That's account prime for thievery. Is appropriation looking at that at all?
Senator Hicks.
Appropriations Committee is always looking at anything with money in it. The good thing is I guess for this committee is we don't profile that. So while it's on the table, it's off the radar.
Well, that's good to know.
Okay, at this time, I think we'll go to Bobby Frank. Bobby, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee for the opportunity to address the small water program. I think a lot of our issues have been covered, but I do want to just discuss maybe a little more in depth some of the comments that were brought up and share some ideas for the committee to contemplate as you move the discussion forward. First, having been involved from the very beginning when this program was stood up, one of the most important aspects of the program was exactly what Senator Dockstader alluded to, and that was to spread resources and ability to develop water in the state throughout the smaller areas in a manner that affected a lot of multiple resource benefits. And as you know, initially the watershed level 1 watershed study was part of the criteria. Now that the majority of the state is covered in level 1s, combined with the modification in that criteria, recognizing that the state has a lot of other studies in place that identify water development as a tool or a management practice to address those resource priorities. You've seen an explosion in the statewide interest in the program. This program provides us, our local districts, with an avenue to address wildlife resource issues, water quality resource issues, rangeland health resource issues, etc. When we're talking about the economic impact, in addition to those that you've already discussed, this program also serves as match. So when we look at the economic impact, as you move forward to your subsequent meetings, I'd encourage you to take a look at the state water development's kicking in 35,000. What is the remaining portion being brought into these rural communities to our contractors? Because our districts are pretty well experts at marrying, dollar to dollar, and oftentimes returning $1, $2, and $3, whether it be a federal dollar or a private dollar that goes into these projects. So I'd encourage the committee, when you look at, the program as a whole and the impact of the program, and start balancing those cuts or caps that have been thrown out there, to also look at that match dollar component. We recognize there's cuts coming. We recognize that. We recognize you all have huge challenges before you. I'd like to suggest that we look at maybe a hybrid, but also back to the comment of looking at the program as a whole before we preemptively cap or reduce the cost share level on these projects. Just because this program is a quick program that gets work done on the ground, A lot of them are shovel ready, good to go, move forward. So the impact can be huge, and maybe we'll look at a broader set of priorities as you move forward. Mr. Chairman, with that, I think that, this notion of moving up the deadline is great. I think we'd support that. Our districts are the primary applicants. We'd be happy to help in getting the word out, getting the training out, work with the staff at the Water Development Commission to make sure that that's done in advance to allow you to look at the magnitude of the projects across the state and then have an idea going in where you want to be in terms of either caps or the prioritization criteria. And with that, my last comment is just, I really think maybe a revisit of the criteria and evaluate how many of the projects fall within the different sets of criteria. And maybe take a look at going back to the history of the program and reevaluating some of the newer categories for projects in combination with the discussion of, is there a need for a cap and what that cap ought to be look like? Maybe a hybrid of those different components. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to try to answer any questions.
Co-Chairman Larson, are you still there? Yes or no? I think we've lost Co-Chair Larson, but he's back. I see Senator Moniz has got his hands up, so if you'll unmute yourself. Welcome back, Representative Larson. You disappeared in space for a moment there.
Well, I hate to change the subject a little bit since we have Bobby online here. I have a question on that water development or the water program at UW. They said that the request for the antibiotics in the surface water came from conservation districts. Could you elaborate on if you do know what the concern is and maybe a little follow up on that issue?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, thank you for the question, Senator Moniz. I can. As you know, Kathy Rosenthal, our watershed coordinator, serves on that committee. That issue was brought forward by our Laramie County Conservation District in Cheyenne. And they were interested in looking at antibiotics, hormonal, and other medication detections. And excuse me just a moment. I apologize, Mr. Chairman. I'm at the ranch today. Just finished some cattle work and apparently the dog's tired. Anyway, back to your question, Senator Moniz. They were interested in that topic on medication detection and standards in our water conveyance system based on the discussion they're having with City of Cheyenne on water recirculation or reuse ideas. And they've seen some elevated levels of salt in their reuse water for city parks, enough so that it's killed some trees. And so they're wanting to evaluate whether those constituents are having an impact as they look at water reuse. I hope that answers your question, Mr. Chairman.
Follow up? I did get bumped off of my internet, but I'm back. So any other questions for Ms. Frank? Thank you for your comments, Bobby, and we'll keep you on. You may want to talk about the next item also. Any other comments from the Director Gephardt?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Co-Chair Hicks.
Yeah, so Mr. Co-Chair, just a couple action items, I think, for the committee that we may want to look at. And so Brandon, one of the things that I think that would help, and I think this gets to Bobby's point, if we're going to go in there and look at criteria. So prior to the August meeting, could your staff put together a list of all the projects based on criteria? So how many were priority 1 projects, how many priority 2, how many priority 3, and then how much money did those projects? So I think if we get into the idea that we're going to start restricting or reduce the number of priorities, we're going to need that information to make good decisions. So on the new development is that we spend in most of the demand for water wells, stock ponds, diversion structures, or within each one of those priority categories, if you can give us the number of projects and the cost, and I would go back, say 3 years to give us an average instead of, we may have one anomaly 1 year. If you could put that information together, I think it would provide us good information to make better decisions if we decide we want to limit or restrict. If there's priorities out there that aren't being used, maybe that's ones that we want to start getting rid of. If you could do that, any comments on that, Director Gebhardt?
Director Gephardt.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, we'd be happy to do that. We have that information in our database, and it should be pretty easy to pull out.
Okay. And Mr. Co-Chair, one of the other things I think it gets to, we've talked about the economics, but a couple of years ago, this same kind of issue came up in the legislature as far as wildlife natural resource trust fund projects, and what was the economic benefit. So at that point in time, we had actually requested that the University of Wyoming College of Agriculture Ag Economics Division go through and look at that program with the Wildlife Trust Fund and run some economic analysis on the impact of that program. And they would go out and pull a number of projects and look at those and how that was expended. So what I would suggest is we as a committee ask the Ag Econ department over there. I don't know if Tex Taylor's still over there. He did the work for us with the trust fund. But see if so I would ask our LSO staff to contact them and find out what it would take to get a request in to them to come in and actually look at the economic impact on rural communities of the small water project program. Again, the idea is we'll make better decisions if we've got better information. Obviously, that will take a year or two to probably put together, but we've got that resource at the University of Wyoming. I would suggest, if it's something the committee would like, that we follow up with that request to do an economic evaluation of the program. Any thoughts on that, committee?
Don't see any hands.
I saw a thumbs up from Senator Anselmi Dalton. Thumbs up from Representative, and I think Representative Blake, that's a big thumb.
Okay, well, let's plan on that. Director Gephardt, do you have any comments?
Mr. Chairman, that sounded like it was more directed towards LSO, and I didn't know what you wanted us to participate in.
I'll bet Abigail and Josh can help us. Any other discussion on this item? I don't see any hands up. Okay, let's go on to the next item is application fees for level 1 studies. And I don't know who is main contact on this. I know Representative Hunt and the Ag Committee, we kind of discussed a little bit about this. Chairman Hunt, would you comment on that, or do you have some comment?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair. the last couple days, Monday and Tuesday, Ag Committee met, and we had, a good conversation with the Wyoming Water Development Council folks and out of the office. And Director Gebhardt gave a great overview of, especially for those who are on the Ag Committee who are not on this committee. I think those folks got a good, educational overview of the funding model and how the funds are distributed and so on and so forth. But as to what Chairman Hicks had said earlier about the changing the percentage of how that's allocated and how that's funded, we didn't get anything drafted on that per se. We did have a little bit of discussion about it, but mainly what it came down to was whether or not that was appropriate for the Ag Committee to bring, or whether that should be done by here in Select Water. What we did put together was a bill draft, requested a bill draft that would allow, would require a routine report from the Water Development Office on a sort of a tally, inventory of our irrigation and water infrastructure and the condition of it. And that goes in hand with our assigned topic from Management Council on, reviewing the state of our state's water infrastructure and the, deterioration of it, and trying to prioritize where we look next for rehabilitation and repairs of structures. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope that answers that. I'll try and answer any other questions related to that, but we didn't spend a ton of time on this, as those of you who are also on Ag Committee know, but like I say, I think that the discussion that we did have was very productive and was very worthwhile. So thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Hunt. Representative Simpson.
The reason this is on our agenda today is, as you recall, in the last session, the Senate passed an amendment on the omnibus study bill to significantly increase the application fees for the studies. And fortunately, the president of the Senate sent a conference committee group over, and we were able to negotiate that back out. But it wasn't definitely a message to us that the $1,000 fee is too low. I would submit to you that the $1,000 is probably the right size for our smallest districts and smallest towns. But certainly our bigger cities, the Cheyennes of the world, and the largest irrigation districts that would require a much bigger study, a lot more money would be involved in their studies. They could do that. But what I suggested to the Ag Committee yesterday was that we really ought to do this in the correct form. If we're going to raise the fees, our water development staff ought to work with alternatives and present it to the Water Development Commission, and then the commission would present it to us and the Select Water Committee for consideration. So I think we kind of nodded our head that direction, and I think the director is in line to do that, to discuss that with his group, and perhaps a tiered approach on application fees for the studies may be appropriate based on the Senate's desire to increase those fees.
Co-Chair Hicks.
Yeah, and just a little clarification, the amendment that the Senate put on, it didn't necessarily deal with actually the fee structure, which is certainly an area I think we need to look at. What the amendment did said any of the level one plan or any of the planning studies that the sponsor would have to provide 10% of the funding. So they would have still had to pay the $1,000 application fee and then 10% of the cost of the study. Then if that study went all the way to level 3 construction, any of the funding that they had put towards the planning would be credited back as the sponsor's contribution towards the construction of the project. So it was I'll use the analogy of earnest money. So you put your earnest money up during the planning stages. If you went to the construction, it was credited against your 33% cost. I think the fee schedule that Representative Simpson and I think the Ag Committee talked about may be the alternative direction to that. But specific to the amendment, that's what the amendment that the Senate put on. I do agree with Representative Simpson. Well, we concurred on the Senate to pull that out, to allow the commission the time and to vet that, get the public involved with that. But the idea is at some point in time, we've got to have some skin in the game. Even if we go with the graduated fee schedule, which I think that has some real merits, which may actually reduce the cost for some of those lower cost studies. I think at some point in time, even there, you would want to look at allowing even some contribution back. If we get to fees on a graduated schedule that become significantly large, you may want to look at a situation where you want to credit back that part of that feedback to the sponsor's contribution. But I would concur with Representative Simpson and what the Ag Committee talked about. Maybe we need to look at a graduated fee schedule. I do think it's very important to get the input of the office and the commission on this. With that, Mr. Co-Chair, I would just ask Director Gephardt again for his thoughts on that.
Thank you, Co-Chair Hicks, for the clarification. And I think we'll go to Director Gephardt. I think he has heard this many times, and maybe he can comment on what are.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So going back to the legislative session and the amendment to put a percentage on the application fee, one of our biggest concerns at that time, particularly with the percentage, is just the implementing a percentage with our process. And with our process, we don't know what the cost of the study is until well down the road, even after we get the appropriation. So telling them what they owe is very problematic. The message was heard that, yes, we need to look at the application fees. So some of the thoughts that we've been thinking about, and it goes to the graduated fee schedule, and looking at something like that where it's already predefined would help the sponsor know what they are getting into prior to making an application, as well as assist us in I guess collecting the appropriate amount. Some of the thoughts, and I don't disagree that we look at application fees. We're definitely willing to do that. I'll throw out some thoughts that we have as an agency on why these are, why they've historically been very low. We do see value in allowing the sponsor to not pay a lot for a study to save their money for implementation of projects as they are vetted out. So saving the money for implementation. The other thing that I think initially some of the thought that went into this is to help get an objective view from the consulting world, rather than the sponsor sometimes may or may not try to influence their desires rather than their needs in these studies. And so this is kind of a way to help us have not necessarily control, but to help dictate what the project actually is and the information that we get from our studies. To look at more the need rather than the wants, and to make sure that we want to invest state's money in those projects. So there's also that component to this as we wrestle with what the best way to do this is. Having said that, I do think that as we go forward, what we're kind of leaning towards is some sort of a graduated fee schedule to present to the commission. What that looks like, we don't know yet, and what that amount is, we don't know yet, but we've got many different types of studies, and some of them are gonna be easier to define than others. Master plans for one. We could look at, how many taps, or what's the size of an entity, whether it be irrigation or a municipality. That's something concrete that I think we can assign some values to. There's other studies that aren't quite as straightforward and simple that we'll have to think about. I do think that we're not going to catch everything this first go around, so this will probably be a fluid process, and it'll probably take amending as we go through it. But we've heard the point. We're willing to look at it, and we're going to make some recommendations to the commission in August.
Okay, that sounds good. Any other comments, committee? Senator Moniz.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Another thing, discussing what the Ag Committee discussed on Representative Hunt's kind of overview, we also discussed, and Brandon, you might be able to help us here, that under the cap severance tax issue for water development too, and if that percentage was appropriate. And I think I heard that our LSLO was going to get with water development and see if that was an appropriate percentage. And what I'm hearing from our discussion here today is that may be fairly volatile. And I'm wondering if we'd ought to leave it alone. What's your thoughts, Senator Hicks and the rest of the committee?
Any comments, Co-Chair Hicks?
Yeah, right now, I think we ought to leave that alone. I don't know that we want to bring any more attention to it, but on the bigger scale, we can adjust that appropriation every year in the omnibus water bills. So, and we've moved money around from account 1, account 2, Buffalo Bill, and all these accounts. So if there is a higher level of demand in rehab, we have the legislature the authority to move that money anyway. So my inclination would be just to leave those percentages alone, but I would like to get the director's input on that too. I just don't see the need when we have through the process already, Senator Moniz, that if we're come up short, and I know we've done this in the past, moved a little bit of funding from one account to not so much the account, but the projects, we funded them out of a different account. So, but my inclination is to leave the percentages alone.
This was going to be a topic we were going to consider a little later. Do we want to just jump right on that right now? Is that the committee's choice, or is that?
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Yes, Director.
I think we're getting two different topics mixed up a little bit here. One of them is application fees that sponsors would pay the program to do a study, a level 1 or level 2 study. What Mr. Moniz is referring to, I think, is a different topic that I do want to bring up and take up. And that has to do with the funding of the agency and those different percentages on that. However you want to handle that, we can handle it right now. And I have thoughts on that too, but I think we're talking two different topics right now.
Yes. Yes, Director, you're correct. We're on application fees and level, and I think we give you a direction on a couple topics that we would, I think the committee would like you to proceed with the commission. And is there any other comments on that, on the application fees for level 1 in studies? I don't see any. Okay, I think we'll go to the next topic, and that is orphan water rights. And at this time, we'll have the state engineer Lanning and Board of Control Mr. Smith talk about some of this. It's a subject that I was interested in, and I got information from Mr. Smith on this. I actually work with the state engineer's office as a hydrographer. And some of these topics are pretty important. And I think just worrying about water rights and especially our earlier water rights and not being able to get those to be used again is very important. Co-Chair Hicks.
Yeah, Mr. Co-Chair, I see that we made a minor error when we finished the application fees for level 1 studies. We didn't take any public comment. I think we ought to go back and do that to see if there is any public comment before we move down the agenda.
Mr. Co-Chair, I am sorry, and you are correct. And I would guess Bobby Frank maybe is on the on here, and if she's there, we'll get her on. I'm sorry. Let's go to that topic.
Can you hear me, Mr. Chairman? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, conservation districts are one of the sponsors primarily of the level 1 watershed studies. And so we look forward to being part of the conversation on the application fee or some sort of structure to that as you move forward. I do think there's some merit to looking at it, and I can only speak specifically to that component, the level 1s, but to a percentage type approach that would help ensure that there's skin in the game, but also serve as an incentive to ensure we're focusing studies on specifically what those needs are, and maybe prioritize a little better what we're looking for out of the studies. They have been very valuable for those districts that have been sponsoring those studies. We appreciate them. They serve multiple purposes far beyond even identifying small water projects. So they're important to us, but we understand that we need to have a role in that and look forward to participating in that conversation.
Thank you, Bobby. To end before we left the topic, are there any questions for Bobby Frank? I do not see any. Okay, now we'll go on to the next topic, orphan water rights. And I think I'll just send it to the state engineer, Lanning, and Board of Control, Lawrence.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Co-Chair. This is Greg Lanning, the state engineer, and this will be a pretty quick handoff to Superintendent Smith. I know in the few meetings that I've joined the Board of Control, this has come up in the meetings that I've been there where specific to subdivision development, perhaps around urbanized areas, as they grow into established irrigation districts, in terms of annexation or just growth in the county in those areas, they will cover up or displace irrigated acreage. And so we struggle with at these meetings, what to do with those water rights that have been developed over. In the event, we try first of all to place them with the irrigation district, within the irrigation district somewhere else, or find a use for them through the subdivision development process itself. But you'll hear from Superintendent Smith how there is those rights that tend to fall between the cracks and then become subject to abandonment. And for some of these irrigation districts, they were established at the turn of the century, are very senior rights. And so therefore, if we do abandon them, we're perhaps losing a good source of senior water. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Superintendent Smith.
Superintendent Smith. You may be muted.
How about now? Is that better? There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee, and Director Lanning, for this opportunity. As mentioned, most of the state is covered by within compacts with our interstate neighbors, and And those downstream neighbors are constantly looking upstream for additional water supplies. Most of those compacts, they typically have some protection built into them for senior water rights that existed at the time the compact was adopted. And that protection is limited only by the number of acres of that global universe of water rights that existed at that time. As development is occurring around municipalities especially, we see that these senior water rights that are senior to the compact adoption dates are being abandoned by developers pretty easily. Because that's the cheapest and easiest alternative for them. But what this does in turn is diminishes the standing of the state of Wyoming against our downstream neighbors when it comes to how much water we have available to us under these compacts. So because these developments are very close to municipal areas, there's not a lot of municipalities in this state that have enough surface water rights that they can live off just their surface water rights. We're continually looking to wells to supplement this supply. We're looking at reservoirs, large projects, things like this that are very expensive to shore up their water supply and give them a firm water supply to live off of on a daily basis, but also into the future. They should have a little room to grow. And because of the way development has occurred over time, we have these, what we consider orphan water rights, where the source of supply has been severed from the lands that it's supposed to irrigate. And these are typically really good irrigation rights. Sheridan, Cokeville, Marbleton, Jackson Hole, Riverton, this occurs everywhere. We have these water rights that are just sitting out there unused, and they're not very available for change because of this lack of use. So trying to come up with a process that is a win-win when we have such an intertangled web of problem, it came to mind that if we could allow a temporary change on a longer term, 3 to 5 years, to allow the Board of Control time to evaluate changes of these water rights to a municipal supply, to shore up those supplies for the towns and cities of the state, while the board is able to evaluate these for injury, to make sure that if this change goes through as a petition and becomes a permanent change, that we're not injuring other senior water right holders downstream or even upstream in some cases. So if the proposal would be that we amend Title 41-3-110 to allow these longer term changes to occur for municipalities to where we can do that evaluation. Once that evaluation period is done, they have established some historic use that can then be changed to the new municipal right and municipal supply right. This in turn would shore up the town supply. The state would hold on to these senior water rights that are so valuable to this state. And we would also then need to look at our change petition or process, and the statute which we fall under there is 41-3-104, which has the strict language in it that we struggle with on historic use and consumptive use. And we can, I think, overcome that with some wording in the temporary change statute that those temporary changes to municipal supply can be utilized to establish the historic use for a permanent change. That cleans that end of it up. But then to prevent this from happening in the future, what we'd like to see is possibly a tweak to Title 15 to make it parallel with the requirements of county government under Title 18, where subdividers are required to come into the state engineer with a plan of how they're going to handle their water rights through that development. Do they distribute it among the lots? Do they sign it over to the city through petition process, something like that, so that we don't end up in the same situation? Right now, we have thousands and thousands of acres that is essentially hostage to these municipalities. These lands are ripe for abandonment, and we don't want to see them abandoned. They're too valuable. So that's in a nutshell what the issue is. And I think if we could work towards some solutions through these statutory changes, then we could save some money for the state down the road. We could clean up some of these issues that we're fighting against. These orphan rights cause a nightmare when it comes to other petitioners coming in before the board, because if those orphan rights are in a facility that is in between 2 points of diversion that they're changing their water rights from, they must go out and seek consent from all of these owners of these orphan rights. And this can be thousands of certified mailings, large hearings. We held one probably 10, 12 years ago on a similar tribe by the city of Lander that ended up failing in the end because of the consent burden and the historic use burden that we could address through these type of changes. And every town, I think, that that uses surface water in the state for their municipal supply is kind of faced with this same issue. So we'll leave it at that.
Is there some questions for either of the gentlemen? Co-Chair Hicks.
Yeah, Lauren, it seems to me the problem is a lot bigger than just municipalities. And my time in the legislature, we've had 2 bills that have tried to deal with this. And a lot of it's the 5-year period of if you don't change it, we've had farmsteads that have expanded, another family built onto it, and then they missed the 5-year window to do the change of place of use of that water. So are you suggesting, the way I understand it, you're talking about, so we do a 3 to 5 year temporary change of use, and then after that period, the board would make a determination under the temporary change of use if there was an injury, and then it could go to a change of use or change of place of use. Is that also being considered, or just a change of use?
Mr. Smith. I think you're muted.
You're muted.
I keep clicking on, are we good now?
We can hear you now.
Yes, we are.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Hicks, you are correct. I think in the end, ultimately, when they come in after the temporary change period, they come in with a permanent petition to change the use, the area of use that would include the municipal boundaries fully, because that's where that water is going to be used, and likely a change of point of diversion and means of conveyances along with that. That would be one single petition packet essentially to the Board of Control at that point in time. I think we have the ability at that time also to require a public hearing, to go out to the location, the municipality, and hold a hearing to hear what other concerns other appropriators in that system may have as well. So we can pretty well vet these things out and see if there's any injury or concerns that could crop up through that process.
So real quick question, Mr. Co-Chair, Mr. Smith. So how do you suggest that we deal with the 5-year limitation with this moving forward? Because obviously the vast majority of orphan water rights have not been used much longer than just the last 5 years. So how do you anticipate dealing with that?
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The 3 to 5 years, that's the point I was discussing about some of the amendment to that temporary change statute, where we expand that period of time to the 3 to 5 years, also would need to be worded such that that trial period essentially could be utilized for the recent historic use measure. We typically look back on the Board of Control, we look back 3 to 5 years as it is to establish what the recent historic use has been and how much consumption has been in that water right. So I think that can all be handled through the changes to 41.3.110 in that process.
So just, Mr. Chairman, Co-Chair, just to be clear, so what happens if this orphan water right hasn't been used for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, subdivision put in, getting back to the Title 15, There's been no irrigation. Would those be eligible to come in and under this process and be reconsidered? Because I agree with you. Territorial and early compact water rights is the craziest thing we could do, is end up in abandoning those. So what about these older ones? Do you envision them being able to avail themselves of the same process?
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I do. The way we look at those water rights today, if there has been no abandonment action against those water rights, they are still in good standing in the state of Wyoming. Their only problem is they don't have a means to get water to those lands. And so we feel that if those are adjudicated, they've been proven up, they've been on our books, they are valid. And then if they can go in today and activate those rights in some other form and start irrigating those lands, that's fully legal to those folks and available to them.
Yeah, and I understand that, but I'm talking about the scenario where you have a farm or a ranch and they've expanded their corrals and their machine shed, and then they put another house for a family member on there, and they've taken out 3 or 4 acres that was previously irrigated. Those would not be eligible for coming in and doing a change of place of use or change of use on those lands, because they're not going to reactivate those.
Mr. Smith.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. It depends, Mr. Senator Hicks. I believe that, our first blush was to look at the municipalities as a test case, and down the road, maybe those are available to be changed elsewhere. I don't think it'd be a big deal to move those. If we have lands that have been irrigated without the benefit of a right today, we often look at changes of that sort where the use is discontinued at the original permitted place, but they've been using it down here on a similar number of acres, and those changes go through quite often. Until abandonment is brought, those rights are valid. So.
Okay, thank you. That's the real issue that I want to make sure that if I don't want to just carve out a process specific for municipalities, it needs to be for, make sure that that's equitable for any, if you're irrigator and you want to do that, instead of change it just to a municipal use, that whatever we do is effects, and that opportunity exists for all water users and water rights holders, not just municipalities.
Representative Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want the committee to know that I've run across this many, many, many times in my career, and I just shiver to think that we're going to potentially lose these earlier priority rights. We would do a huge service to our citizens by adopting a process where we can just once and for all get these guys reappropriated and readjusted so that we maintain those rights from the downstream water users. I think this is a very important issue, and we ought to put some effort into it.
Any other comments? I definitely think this ought to be a topic we keep working on. I don't know what suggestions everyone has, but I would sure be willing to help with the Board of Control and state engineer, and maybe we can have a little committee. I do have one other issue that I would like to bring up that is pretty much tied to this, and Mr. Smith can help me on this. I think in planning and zoning regulations with the county, currently, if a subdivider comes in and it's above 5 divisions, I think, they are required to do something with those water rights under the roads and the houses and stuff like that. And I think one of the requirements is if you can't find a place to put them, you need to abandon them. And that does cause issues with a specific district up here in Heart Mountain Irrigation District, where they are now limited on by Bureau regulations or agreement that they weren't supposed to bring in new lands. So I was wondering if there was some way we could deal with that, that if an irrigation district did not want to abandon those, that they could just sit there. I don't know if that's the way to say that or not, but they definitely don't want to lose them. And I think the statute right now says they need to abandon those.
So,
Mr. Smith.
Mr. Co-Chair, and I would ask Mr. Smith, would there be an opportunity to put a secondary right on an existing water right with those?
Mr. Smith.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, thank you. Yeah, I think Mr. Representative Larson is correct in his interpretation of the Title 18 law, that essentially they are availed of that, or need to avail themselves of that opportunity to move those water rights off those subdivided lands, and whether it's in an irrigation district or not. We do run into this problem on Bureau projects such as the Hart Mountain, Shoshone Irrigation Project, Midvale. The larger Bureau projects do not allow expansion within. They can't just go out and get a new permit. And this is also the case under the North Platte, under that decree, where we cannot get any more water rights. And I think we broached this subject back in the, I want to say, the early 90s, when we looked at a banking proposal where we could park those water rights, those unused rights, for a period of time. We ran into some real hurdles at that time because of the measure of historic use. While those water rights are parked, can we go back to the pre-development phase and look at the use that water right was on prior to the development occurring? And that was at the time looked at probably as not the best option under the statutory guidelines that we have. Those guidelines have not changed. That's why I'm asking in the amendment of 41.310 or 110, the temporary change statute, that we build into that wording that there is an allowance that temporary use, as it's being evaluated for injury, can be utilized as the historic use for recent time to allow those changes to move forward down the road. But until we have a banking type scenario, it is difficult to find a home for all those water rights. We push and push and push. And it's not just irrigation districts. It's the little mom and pop that build a reservoir that water right under that reservoir is going to disappear in 5 years if they don't move it. And trying to find a place for these senior water rights that are so valuable to the state is getting very difficult. In answer to Senator Hicks's question, yeah, you could stack a supplemental or a secondary supply reservoir right on top of those original supply. Some of those rights in, say, Shoshone Irrigation District will have an original supply. They'll have secondary supply from Buffalo Bill, but they'll also have 3 or 4 supplemental supplies from alternate sources that can also contribute to water to those fields as well. So all of that would fit in the same bundle.
Any other questions? We were really getting in the weeds there, but I think this is a pretty important topic. I hope the committee will say we should proceed. Co-Chair Hicks.
So, Mr. Co-Chair, I'll make a recommend we proceed in this fashion. What I'd like to see is for the Board of Control and the State Engineer's Office to do a markup of 41.3.110, 41.3.104, and then also bring in the suggested language they'd like to see under Title 15 with the subdivisions and stuff, so that we can actually look at how that fits into statutory components. And then hopefully have them mark that up. Obviously, they can avail themselves to Chris Brown, but also would like to have our LSO staff, Josh and Abigail, work directly with them on that and review that as we move forward. And then have that ready prior to our next committee meeting and have that out for public review prior to the next meeting. I would just tell you, There's always something out there when we get into this that somebody, I can remember the last time that we tried to do this in the Senate Ag Committee. And you'll be amazed at what kind of black helicopters come flying in when they see this proposal. So I'm just thinking of a 40,000 acre water right over the hill from Baggs here in the Platte Valley that seems to get really wrapped up about moving these historic water rights. Anyway, that would be my suggestion to move forward is let's look at an actual draft that changes to the language and have that ready. So, and then get it out and plenty of time to advertise for the public prior to our August meeting for public comment.
Thank you, Co-Chair. I would, we got a second with Senator Dockstader. I would hope you would include Title 18 with the county issue where the requirements for subdivisions in there also to clarify some issues there.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Abigail.
I'm looking at the calendar and it looks like probably by July 24th to have it posted on LSO website. Is that sufficient? That would be 2.5 weeks before the meeting in August.
I think that would work great
Okay.
if we can get State Engineer's Office and Board of Control on that and with you and Josh, we'll see what we can come up with. Do we need to vote on that or is that? I think we're good. Let's just plan on it. Any other discussion on this topic real quick? Public comment. I don't know if Bobby's still there. I think she's the only one out there.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have any comments.
Thank you. All right. Well, we'll go on to the next topic. Thank you, Superintendent and State Engineer. Next item is hydrologically connected surface and groundwater. And I'm not sure who's, maybe Co-Chair Hicks is going to take this on, or is Josh? I think Josh also sent something out.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would ask LSO to give us an update on what they've found out with other state laws and rules within each state. So I'll turn it over to whoever Josh or Abigail is going to field this.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Josh Anderson, LSO. Senator Hicks asked to just have a kind of a look at what some other states had done. So I sent out, or Abby actually sent an email yesterday with this document. I think it's also available on the website, or if it's not, it will be soon. But we just tried to kind of look at what some other states had done with definitions of hydrologically connected. Just a couple of quick caveats first, I guess. First, you'll see, states have gone a lot of different ways. And depending on the terminology, there's likely states that we missed when we did this review. And then also a lot of other states have done a lot of this work in their case law, and we didn't have time to do a deep dive into that. So as we go through this, if you want additional information, we're certainly happy to do a deeper dive into this. If you can give us maybe what states you do or don't want us to look into, that would be helpful. But if you just take a look at the memo, you'll find, I think, 5 states that we found that had some statutory either definitions or at least mentions of the idea of hydrologically connected surface and groundwater. Probably the first 2 are the most technical. Colorado has a definition of non-tributary groundwater, which is groundwater located outside the boundaries of any designated groundwater basins, the withdrawal of which will not within 100 years of continuous withdrawal deplete the flow of a natural stream, including a natural stream, and then it goes on from there. But that's essentially the idea there of 100 years of continuous withdrawal not depleting the flow of a stream. And then in Montana, they have defined several different ways in statute and these are mostly in compacts. And in their first compact there, hydrologically connected means groundwater that is connected to surface water such that appropriation of the proposed rate will cause a calculable reduction in surface water flow. And then they define calculable reduction in surface water flow to mean a theoretical reduction based on credible information opposed to a measured reduction. Then you can see there's some other definitions that are then much less technical than that. So Montana also in other areas uses the definition of the interconnection of groundwater and surface water such that they constitute one water supply, and use of either results in an impact to both. And then Nebraska is another state that has kind of a very broad definition, almost a circular definition, where hydrologically connected area means a geographic area within which the department considers surface water and groundwater to be hydrologically connected. So almost a circular definition there. And then New Mexico and Utah at the end there, those actually aren't definitions. They do talk about the idea of an area of hydrological effect or a hydrologically connected waters, but they don't necessarily define those, at least not in statute. With that, I stand for any questions.
Are there any questions? Go ahead, Co-Chair Hicks.
Mr. Co-Chair, Josh, did you send that to State Engineer's Office, the memo and the Board of Control, if it's not been posted?
I don't think we've sent that yet, but we can certainly send it to them for sure.
Yeah, I'd like you guys to go ahead and send that over to them to start looking at.
Mr. Chairman, I am getting that posted right now.
And then while we've got Board of Control on here, getting back to your question earlier, Josh, I would like the LSO staff to look at case law, and specifically only in those prior appropriation states that use prior appropriation doctrine. I don't think we need to look at any state that's uses riparian doctrine as their water law to have any implication to what we're trying to get to. Also would like LSO staff to have some conversations with Board of Control and the State Engineer's Office on the issue of specific basin definitions and prior to our August meeting to see if there is a direction that we can use as a statewide kind of statutory definition, or based on compact, the North Platte, Yellowstone, may already have something in those decrees or settlements that talk about groundwater. I want to make sure that if we do a statutory definition, that we don't get somehow crossways with a decree or a compact issue that's already been determined. I know there's issues that Chris Brown has brought up with the Yellowstone, specifically with exporting groundwater. But I'm just curious as to whether they think we would need a basin by basin definition, or whether we can have one broad statutory definition that then could be rules wrote underneath that for each basin if it was under the guidance of a compact. And I guess I would ask Greg and Lauren for that, and any input back again too, Josh, on your thoughts. So
whoever wants to speak first, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Greg. Senator Hicks, I appreciate the direction, and I understand it wholly. I understand what you're getting at. For instance, just as an example, it is defined in the North Platte, and I think you're referring to that, and that's if I were to pump for a groundwater well within a certain area of the North Platte River for 40 years, if it then can be determined that it's taking at least 28% from the surface water source, then it's interconnected in that sense. So we do have a pretty direct and firm definition in the North Platte. As a result of that, maps were developed. We call them green areas, for instance, where the green areas then define where you can develop a new well, perhaps, if it's still fit under other criteria in the North Platte. So we have one example of that's pretty, referring back to what Josh said, kind of scientifically approached. You'll see the hydrographers come into this, the hydrogeologists, they call it, steady state. If I pump a well for quite a long time, then what's its effect in terms of drawdown or interference? And so that's where the science and the technology comes into that. And so you may hear other definitions related to that. Colorado's was pretty restrictive under that, pump it for 100 years, and if it has any effect whatsoever. So you can tell they don't necessarily want groundwater developed at all because of its effect potentially on surface water. And by the way, when it gets to that point, then groundwater is then regulated in priority with surface water, conjunctively managed. And I was in Idaho for 12 years as we went through those conjunctive management rules, and so I got very familiar in the upper Snake River Basin, the groundwater effect on surface water. And so I think I know some of the details as well as the pitfalls related to those discussions.
Any comments from Mr. Smith or Josh Anderson?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. The board has dealt with this a little bit over time on a lot smaller scale. Typical regulation, our hydrographers are out regulating surface water diversions on streams that are short of water. Appropriators quickly figured out that if they went in along in the alluvium and these drainages and dug pits and placed pumps in them, that would be a groundwater diversion and they wouldn't be regulated with the surface water source. And so we've gone through this issue regulatorily over time, and now groundwater permits, when they are issued in an area where they could have an impact, we add the limitation to that permit that says that this could be or is considered hydrologically connected, and it will be regulated along with the surface water source priority. Probably the biggest case we've had over time was the Bates Creek case, where we had a number of wells that were very junior, and the impacts on some of those wells was seen and visible on the surface water source in regulation. Other wells were far enough away from that surface water source that they could pump for 25 years and never see an ounce of water come out of that stream. And those wells were allowed to continue to pump. So we have looked at this on a smaller scale, but the large scale, like you say, has got to come out of some of this compact language. And I know Mr. Brown is quoting Yellowstone Compact, and that's where that groundwater language comes from there. So that would be all I'd have. Thank you.
Any questions? Josh, do you have some comments?
No, Mr. Chairman, we're happy to work with State Engineer's Office, Border Control, and Mr. Brown at the AG's office and take a deeper look at this. I would note, as Senator Hicks said, Montana has several different definitions in statute because they have kind of different definitions for their different compacts. So certainly something that we can get ironed out, but we're happy to look into that.
So, Mr. Co-Chair.
Yes, Co-Chair. Yes.
What I would ask is when we get to our August meeting, that the State Engineer's Office, Board of Control, if you've got some preferred language, and then also whether you think we need to do basin by basin and get that information to Josh. Again, I would like to get that out for public review, so 2 weeks before our August meeting, if that's possible. But take a stab at it, and we'll continue discussing at that point in time. But I would like to see, whether we really need to do this basin by basin. My guess is compacts is going to be yes. But maybe we can something broad enough that meets all the compact criteria and then work directly with Josh and figure out if when we get to August, that you have a specific recommendation and even any specific language that you think that we can utilize. So.
All right, can we get that to work, you think, Josh?
We'll certainly do our best, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any other discussion on this topic? Public comment, anyone? All right, I don't see any. We'll go on to the next topic. We discussed this a little bit already, changing distribution formula. Does anybody have comments on that?
Yeah, Mr. Co-Chair, I think this is what Senator Moniz was talking about. Senator Moniz, I'm assuming this is what your earlier comment is the distribution formula between account 1 and account 2, how that's parsed out. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman. I think, if I remember right, our LSO was directed to get with Brandon and take a look at that. And as we've discussed it today, I'm a little concerned about whether we do that or not, but I'm sure Brandon's got an opinion, so I'd like to hear that.
Director Gephardt, do you have an opinion?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Moniz, I do have a comment on it, and I wasn't quick enough the other day to put that thought into this. But really what was asked is, do we need help in shuffling money so that we can move money to one of our accounts where we see a larger demand or not? And afterwards, and putting some thought to it, I really think we've got that ability already. We go through the omnibus water bills every year to appropriate money, and we have done it in the past. We continue to do it. An example is transferring money out of our Buffalo Bill account to help one of our accounts. I see no reason why we couldn't do that between account 1 and account 2 if those are the 2 accounts we're looking at. So I feel that we already have the ability to make that request to the legislature to do that without having to go back in and open up the percentages and readjust those. So I feel that we've already got the ability through our process to accomplish that.
Any Representative Simpson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was actually the one that made that motion because every single year we come up against this problem of not having enough money in water development account 2. So it is in the works, and staff is going to bring back a proposed legislation for us to the next agriculture meeting. I've also had second thoughts. Yesterday I was contemplating that and began to worry that maybe this timing for this adjustment was really, really off, because it would allow someone who is not friendly to the water program to hijack. And actually, our idea was to just tweak account number 1 and number 2 and not ask for more money or not less, but someone could actually hijack that and change the percentage downward and catch us off guard. And so I'm rethinking that. It's going to come back before the Ag Committee. I think probably the idea would be to kill that proposed legislation and let it sit for another few years, and let's just wait this out and not open the door that someone could hijack us. So that would be my thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you, Representative Simpson. Do you have a comment, Chairman Hunt? Okay, is any other discussion on this topic? Senator Moniz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's, I think, at least 4 of us, maybe 5 of us on the Ag Committee, on this committee as well. And Chairman Hunt, I wonder if it wouldn't be wise for you to communicate with Senator Boner and maybe poll our Ag Committee, and because I think I agree with Representative Simpson, we're treading where we may not want to go here. So that would be my suggestion, Representative Hahn, is you maybe communicate with Representative or Senator Boner, and if it's all right with Simpson, since he's the one that made the motion, to maybe back off on this situation.
Chairman Hunt?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Senator Moniz, yeah, I think that's a good idea. I'll get a hold of Co-Chairman Boner and you know, we'll get together on that and see what we'd like to do. And I may send out a informal poll via email to the full Ag Committee just to get their feelings on that too, so that we're not stepping on each other's toes between the two committees. So thanks for bringing it up.
Any other discussion before we move on?
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Yes, Director.
Similar to this was another topic that was discussed in Joint Ag to address aging infrastructure. And we were looking at, and we proposed to issue a survey to help us get a grasp on what aging infrastructure and what the liabilities are and maybe what kind of funding we got. And as part of that discussion, I think the idea of drafting some legislation to again help us require participation in the survey in the name of condition assessment. And again, not quick enough on the punch, but to be honest, I think we already do this, what they're suggesting this legislation would do. We require that anybody else that applies to our program, that they have to fill out an irrigation survey. So rather than proposing new legislation to require them to participate in the survey, I believe we've already got that covered. It would just be a matter of amending our survey and the information that we're requesting and getting the information that way without having to do any new legislation. So I bring it up as a similar topic to the percentages.
Thank you, Director. I think there's many of us on here that are on that Ag Committee. We probably ought to just throw it right at the Chairman Hunt, and he can discuss it with Chairman Boner and let the Ag Committee do what they need to do. But I'm sure you'll let them also know. Co-Chair Hicks.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I did look at the Joint Ag Committee discussion on that. And one of the things that kind of stood out to me is only those subdivisions of state government are eligible to participate in water development. So irrigation, water conservancy districts in the big program. And we have a lot of irrigation infrastructure out there that wouldn't be captured under that survey anyway. Especially where you have a lot of direct diversions, smaller tributaries that are not in an organized subdivision of state government. So even to go to the extent to collect that data, it's always going to be lacking in information. Now, that being said, those entities are eligible to participate through the Small Water Project program for aging infrastructure. But I agree, I would concur with Director Gebhardt that for the big projects, it's just a matter, I mean, we fill out that survey every year to be able to participate. So, and the other thing, I'd hate to put legislation in that anybody that irrigates has to fill out the survey. They may not want to participate in programs, and then we'd be mandating that they have to provide private information to the state. And so just a couple of items that I thought that if the Ag Committee moves forward for consideration.
Thanks for your comments. Are there any other discussion on this item? All right, I think we're on to the next item. The bill that passed out of the Federal Senate Committee that Co-Chair Hicks had brought up.
Yeah, and so Mr. Chairman, real quick, we're going to meet our noon deadline here to get done with this thing. Just as an FYI to the committee, the Senate EPW Committee, which is Senator Barrasso chairs, passed out a water infrastructure bill at Senate 3951. It's the American Water Infrastructure Act. If Congress does move forward, it had a unanimous bipartisan support coming out of the Senate. And I just want to highlight a couple of items that are very important to Wyoming. There's a provision in there in that bill that says any state with a population of less than 1 million people is eligible for up to an 80% cost share on new storage. So it would be an 80% federal, 20%. I don't recollect, but I think it's $800 million a year in that. And so if you go back to the 5 states that would be eligible is Vermont, New Hampshire, North Dakota, Wyoming, and Alaska that have populations less than 1 million. And so to that end, I had asked Director Gebhardt to put together a list of potential projects that would be put together or potentially eligible for that, but it could be a boon to our development program, especially Account 3, if that moves forward as part of an infrastructure bill in Congress. With that, I would ask Director Gebhardt if he wanted to add anything or talk about what projects that they have been working with an organization called Family Farm Alliance that represents 11 Western irrigated and put together information to submit in support of that bill as it moved through Senator Barrasso's committee. But with that, I turn it over to Director Gebhardt.
Director Gebhardt.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Yes, we did provide some information to the Family Farm Alliance for their incorporation and consideration. We focused solely on storage and large irrigation rehab projects. It was my understanding that questions were asked of other entities to create listings for municipalities and other types of projects. So the list that we provided is strictly storage and large irrigation projects. And I will just tell you which ones the list we provided them, and it identifies the project, a cost estimate, and the status of those. So the projects we provided are the Casper Alcova Tunnel Rehab. That is not a project that has come through water development, but we are aware of their issues. And we threw a dollar amount at it and put it in this information that we provided. The other projects are the Laprelle Irrigation Dam, the Goshen Tunnel Rehab. We've included the Levitt Reservoir Expansion, Alkali Creek Reservoir, the Wheatland Irrigation District Tunnel Rehab, West Fork Reservoir, North Fork Lake Enlargement, Bull Creek Reservoir, Fontanelle Dam Riprap, and Silver Lake Dam Rehab. All of those, with the exception of Casper Alcova, are in our program in some stage or another.
Any comments on that? Well, let's be in, yes, Co-Chair Hicks.
So, Mr. Co-Chair, what I would like to do is ask LSO to contact Senator Barrasso's office, and for our August meeting, if they could provide just an update of the status of S3951, and if they would like to provide any comments to the committee on that. But it'll be interesting if that moves through. There's a real opportunity there if any infrastructure bills that would be really buoy up the water development program.
I bet they heard you. Josh and Abigail will get them on the agenda if we can get a representative there.
Yep, Mr. Chairman, I can take care of that.
All right, any other discussion on this item? We're pushing the noon by 2 minutes here. We're doing pretty good. I think our next item is a future meeting schedule. I need to ask Co-Chair if our intent is to formally meet with the commission on the 11th, and or can we even do that?
To the extent I think we ought to plan on having that joint meeting, obviously we'll get new direction in the future from both the governors and management council about whether we can do in-person meetings and stuff. But right now I would say let's plan on that. And if something changes, then we'll adapt. And I would ask if there's any latest updates. I know Senator Moniz and Driscoll are on management council, and Senator Anselmi Dalton. Is there any direction from management council about future legislative meetings as far as in person?
Senator Driscoll?
There is, they did not come to a definitive end. It would be the, I'd have to look at my calendar, the last couple of days of June. But they have not finalized that there's yet to be another meeting. The debate was whether we do a meeting in person or not, and whether there was actually a need for one, I think. Does that align with the other management council's members' thoughts?
Any other input? Senator Anselmi Dalton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Right, that's whatever Senator Driscoll said is correct. And they also, some people pushed for the need for broadband to be started earlier, and that was a push for the earlier meeting. Some people felt that it wasn't necessary at all. People were afraid that there might be random bills, and so it was just kind of, I think they were going to meet again, I guess. Isn't that right, Senator Driscoll, to talk about maybe if we should have one?
Mr. Chairman, yes, I believe there'll be another meeting to decide finalized dates. It would be a 5-day session. The way it was set would be on I believe a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, take Sunday off and come back on Monday and maybe Tuesday to finalize it. But there's quite a lot of debate whether we do one in Cheyenne in person or virtually again. And I think there's a pretty good split which way to go.
Senator Moniz.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we need to get back out in the public. This Zooming is working, but nothing beats actually interacting with the public. So I'd like to encourage all of our chairs and the management council to push to get us back out in the public where we belong.
Co-Chair Hicks.
Yeah, Mr. Co-Chair, I understand people's reluctance to go to Cheyenne. So along those lines, I would offer to have the special session here in Baggs, and we can use the community center, and that way nobody has to go to Cheyenne. I see I'm getting a thumbs up from Representative Blake.
I don't care where we go as long as we go somewhere.
Senator Driscoll.
Yeah, I fully agree with Senator Moniz, and back to Baggs, you'll have to deal with Senator Case because he'd like to have it in Lander, I'm sure. But no, I really feel it's time for us to get back together in person and take a run at this thing. So we'll see what it brings. The other thing that was made pretty clear at Management Council, basically there's going to be a handful of bills from each committee, and that'll be the only bills probably that go. Obviously, there's still a process to bring outside bills in, but they're trying pretty hard to keep it to 5 or less bills for each committee, I believe.
So our next meeting will plan on June 11th, and we're going to formally announce that, Co-Chair Hicks.
Well, let's answer the question. I think that the question is I think we plan for the August meeting to be an in-person meeting with the commission, and until circumstances change, let's just plan on that. Director Gebhardt, do we have a location yet on that?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Hicks, yes, the meeting will be in Wheatland. And we will tour the Laprelle Dam and the Wheatland Irrigation District tunnel projects at a minimum.
Okay. All right, so committee, I would go ahead and put that down there now. Mr. Co-Chair, back to your question. What's does the entire committee want to meet on June 11th with water development, or would you just like the co-chairs to do that? What's your predisposition? I don't care one way or another.
Let the co-chairs do it.
Representative Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the co-chairs would be enough. I've lost enough work already. Might have to borrow some money from some of you.
Senator Moniz, I think I heard you.
I agree with Representative Blake.
Any other comments? Representative Hunt? Okay, Mr.
Wait,
Co-Chair, or
Mr. Co-Chair, I want to see a thumbs up or a thumbs down by everyone on the committee. Silence is not consensus. Thumbs up if you think it's okay for the co-chairs. Thumbs down. If you don't, if you want the entire committee. All right, I think we got our marching orders.
And Mr. Chairman, I apologize. It wasn't intentional to exclude you from that. It was just, I missed it. I apologize.
Guess
Okay.
we know who, Mr. Co-Chair, I guess we know who's buying beer on June 11th. don't we?
Barry offered.
Barry, okay.
is there anything else to bring up at this meeting right now?
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I just real quickly, if I could run through my expectations of what we want to provide you and make sure that we're all on the same page. The first one would be to change the small water program deadline to December 1st. That we are going to table and revisit the small water cap discussion till the August meeting. We will provide you a list of all projects, small water projects and priorities at the August meeting. We'll provide alternatives at that meeting to revamp application fees. And one other thing that I would offer, I heard some discussion about the effort to make everybody aware of the importance of the water development program. If there's any information we can get for you to help you with that effort, we would be happy to assist. And I don't know if I missed anything on my action items, but if I did, please let me know.
Thank you, Director. Are there any additions, any other comments? I do not. Oh, there's one. Representative Blake.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the November meeting, some of us recently found out we're going to have opponents. And if I remember right, the November meeting is the day after the election, I believe, or the day of the election. I can't remember. I didn't know if that was changing or not.
Location venue also booked.
Chairman Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, to that point, to what Representative Blake just said, the primary election is, I believe, August 18th. And so I don't know how everybody feels about meeting the 12th through the, the 12th through the 14th, just a few days ahead of that. I don't think that alone is a reason to change the dates, but just thought I'd bring that up as well. So, thank you.
Any other comments?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that we've got the November meeting for the Commission Select Water scheduled for the 4th, 5th, and 6th.
We get the venue booked.
And we've already got the venue booked for that.
I saw somebody else's hand and Co-Chair Hicks. Might be muted.
For the December meeting, that overlaps with the JAC's supplemental budget markup. And I was wondering if we could move that December meeting up a week or back a week, one way or the other.
Director Gephardt.
What's our dates for that?
Right now it's 9, 10, 11.
Mr. Chairman, if we can we look at that and see what issues that brings, and we'll definitely look at that.
Yeah, we don't need an answer right now, but if you will take a look at it, see if there's a possibility, and maybe even I'll send you an email with even during the week, which, you know, the first part of the week would be better than the second part.
Any other comments? With co-chairs agreement, we'll call the meeting adjourned. All righty, thanks everyone.